All right. Good morning and welcome to the September 13th Hanford Advisory Board Budget and Contract. You know me, but I'm Lindsay Summers. I'm the DDFO for the Hanford site. As a reminder, this meeting will be conducted in accordance with the requirements of the Federal Advisory Committee Act. I appreciate your attendance today and I look forward to a great meeting.
All right, thank you, Lindsay. And are we recording? Okay. In accordance with FACA, we want to announce that this meeting is being recorded. And we, as a meeting of the HAB, we are following HAB ground rules. So as I just demonstrated, we need to turn our cell phones to silent if you could. And if there are side conversations, please step outside, or if they're online, perhaps we can wait for a break or for lunch. Remember to hear people for what they're saying and assume that people are coming with good intentions. For an important logistics item, the restrooms are right opposite where you turned right to come down this hall. If you turn left, the restrooms are right there. Today, we'll be going over several items. The first is Hanford contracts, and Ashley Morris is here in the room joining us to make a presentation on this. We'll hear agency perspectives and then open it up for discussion. There will be a break, and then Brian Esparza will assist Ashley in presenting the Hanford Integrated Priorities List, again, followed by agency perspectives and a committee discussion. After that, we'll break for lunch at 11 o'clock, reconvene at 12:30 for a discussion on efforts to enhance the Hanford budget that will be presented by David Bowen from Ecology, again, agency perspectives and a discussion, followed by committee business and committee recognition led by Chris Sutton. Are there any questions about the agenda? With that, we're going to ask if there's any announcements, and Chris, I think you have some.
Right, several announcements here. First, all three of the presentations are kind of question and answer type discussions. So while we'll give time for questions at the end, if you have questions that are pertinent to the topic being discussed, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask them during the discussion. That's how it's set up. Secondly, when Ashley's talking about prime contracts, please remember that the tank farms bid plant contract is still underway. It hasn't been finalized, hasn't been awarded, and because it's in process, DOE cannot really speak publicly about almost anything related to that procurement. It is a procurement process, and so Ashley will probably have to decline any questions you might have related to that, just simply following the standard rules of procurements. And lastly, for those in the room and those of you on the screen, I did bring some cake today to say farewell to the BCC, as this is the last BCC meeting. So you'll have to imagine that you're eating cake at times today, whereas the people in the room can actually enjoy it. So those are the three announcements I have.
And I just have one more announcement that if you are a traveling HAB member, please get your travel for October committee week to Julie as soon as possible. All right, Judy?
Question of clarification. Do we have a slide to share with people online for this?
You should have that slide.
I think you sent it over.
It's not the one it's not in the stuff I sent earlier, but Lindsay had sent it, I think.
Let me resend it to you.
Okay, thank you. So for those on the phone, we have a handout in the room with a summary that Ashley will be going over, and I want to bring it up on the screen for you.
Meanwhile, could you tell me how many people we have in attendance? I'll count. 12 that aren't in the room. Thank you.
That's us and
Yeah.
online.
Or 12 that are not in the room.
Okay, 12 plus us. Okay.
That's a good point, too, Phil.
So if you want to start speaking to it, Judy and Joshua should be in your email in just 1 second.
Fantastic, thank you.
All right. I'll get started. Okay, first off, before I go into the information, I'll give you a little bit of grace too to pull it up on the screen. Let me introduce myself. You have my name. So I am Ashley Morris. I've been with the department, gosh, since circa 2009 timeframe. So I've been here for a few years. I've dabbled in many different things across the organization, but currently, and I say this with pride, I have the longest title, I think, of anyone in the Hanford staff. So currently I am the Deputy Assistant Manager for Business and Financial Operations for the Hanford site, along with being the Deputy Chief Financial Officer. So typically I go behind my boss, Greg Jones, which probably many of you have engaged or met with him before. So it's much easier just to say I'm his deputy, which I like doing that easier. So nonetheless, I am pleased to be able to be here today, and thank you for the earlier comment. I will not be providing any comments on any open acquisitions or solicitations that we have out there, so thank you for that. I will reserve comment. Today, I was invited here to talk a little bit about the Prime Contracts 101. So I think it's great that there's going to be an opportunity for a dialogue, but what I thought I would introduce today is the slide that you have in front of you, and shortly we'll see up on the screen, which just kind of illuminates for you the prime contracts that we utilize in the performance of our mission at the Hanford site. I do want to provide just kind of some additional context that the presentation that you have in front of you, this is the contracts/contractors that perform the preponderance of the work out on the Hanford site. So this is not all inclusive of all contracts that the department has. We have other small contracts in the performance of some of the work that we do, which includes work or support for the department directly itself. So for purpose of this conversation and probably the focus of your interest, I think what we have in front of us today probably is where you're interested in a little bit. So the department utilizes contracts in the furtherance of our mission to be able to provide the work activities and the support needed in our work activities out at the Hanford sites. Utilization of contract generally allows us, the department, to be able to focus on, government functions, including inherently governmental functions. It allows us to optimize expenditures while maintaining quality and efficiencies. And then it's probably most everyone recognizes doing business with the government requires the followance or adherence to a lot of strict rules and regulations. And we want to ensure and provide transparency as well to the government and accountability by the contractors in the performance of their work activities. So that's just kind of a broad brush of, why we utilize contracts to perform our work. So what you see today here is color scheme on here has no meaning, just for clarification. I think it just kind of helps so that your eyes don't get blurred all into one. So it kind of just delineates the different contracts for you here. But to be able to perform the safe and efficient and effective cleanup at the Hanford site, we utilize generally 6 different contracts to provide the performance of our work scope. So I'm just going to step through them a little bit here today. So if it's easier to reserve questions at the end or throughout, however we want to do it, I'm really open to a dialogue. I think probably one that's hit the radar of many of you and has some interest is the first one on those lists here, which is the Central Plateau Cleanup Contract, and this is currently being performed by the CPCCO or the Central Plateau Cleanup Company. This is the Hanford site's end state contract. This is an IDIQ contract that currently is a 10-year contract that has a base year of 5 plus 2 options, a 3-year and a 2-year. So the performance can go through December of 2029 as a base ordering period. The total contract value of this one is currently $10 billion. Predecessor to this one, just for, I think a lot of us are familiar with, mentioned history on the site, was the CH2M Hill contractor. The next on the list is the scope which performs the Hanford Mission Essential Services contract. This is currently performed by the Hanford Mission Integration Solutions contract. Predecessor to this one was the MSA contract, the Mission Support Alliance contract. This contract is a mix, right? So it has the opportunity to, it's a cost reimbursement contract, but has the opportunity to issue task orders under the IDIQ portion of this contract. And those contracts or task orders can also be a myriad of contract types to include cost reimbursable, incentive fee, as well as the firm fixed price. I do want to go back up to CPC-Co. I should just illuminate for you. Currently, the majority of the performance of the work scope under the CPC-Co contract is being performed under a task order, currently numbered task order 4, which is a cost plus incentive fee contract. Jumping back down to the HMIS contract, or the Mission Essential Services contract. Again, this one is also a 10-year contract with a base period of performance of 5 years plus 2 option years, a 3-year and a 2-year. Again, performance of this contract goes through December of 2029. Contract value of this contract is currently $4.0 million. The next on the list is the Occupational Medical Services contract. This contractor is the HPM Corporation. The previous contract, which was several years ago, was also being performed by the HPM Corporation. This is a hybrid contract. That's how we title it. It is a cost reimbursement contract as well as a firm fixed price contract. It also does have the opportunity to leverage an IDIQ component, which allows the ability for the department to issue task orders against it. It is a 7-year contract that had a base period of 3 years plus 2 option periods of a 2 and 2, with performance period currently going through December of 2025. The next on the list is the 222S Analytical Laboratory Services. This contract is currently being performed by the Hanford Laboratory Management and Integration, LLC. This is a cost reimbursement contract with a period of performance that is 7 years, a base performance period of 5 years, plus 2 options of 1 and 1. Performance of this contract goes through January of 2028, and the total contract value of this contract is $513 million. Next on the list, these should not be unfamiliar with most in the room and on the call today, is the tank operations contract, which is being performed in its 14th, 15th year-ish of a 10-year contract, which is being performed by the Washington Rivers Protection Solutions, LLC. This is a cost reimbursement contract that was slated initially to be a 10-year contract that had a base performance of 5 years, 2 options of 3 and 2. And due to, as noted previously, ongoing solicitations, the government has elected to utilize the extension of services for this contract. The initial period of performance for this contract was from 2008 to 2018. We retain an ongoing need for this contract. And the last on the list today is the waste treatment and the mobilization contract, currently being performed by Bechtel National Incorporated. This too is a cost reimbursement contract that had an initial period of performance of 10 plus years. It was awarded in December of 2000. The contract value currently is set at $14.6 billion. And with that, I'd like to open it to questions. Good morning.
Good morning. I was in property management, so let's not talk about Hanford. Let's talk about taking an old house, gutting it, and refurbishing it. And I've got 2 choices. I can do a time and materials with the list of tasks that I want to accomplish, or I can do IDIQ. So I know how I do the time and materials with the list of tasks. How would I do the IDIQ?
So maybe can I reframe your question? I think maybe what I'm hearing you ask me is, what is an IDIQ contract? Right. Okay, yeah. So an IDIQ contract is, it's all defined in the Federal Acquisition Regulations. So that's the base root requirements document for how the government puts together structures and awards a contract, right? So that is where our requirements document is built. So an IDIQ is a type of contract that the government can leverage to perform our work. IDIQ, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity. So typically you would elect to use an IDIQ contract when there is not absolute clarity on the delivery necessary or the quantity necessary and performance of whatever scope it is that the department needs to do, okay? So that's why you would typically elect that type of contract. Generally, what you do is you elect, or not elect, you go through the acquisition process, same as if you're awarding a cost reimbursement, same as time and materials, same as a firm fixed price, right? The base process is exactly the same. And you are then letting an award for a base contract with the ability to issue at some point during an ordering period that's established some type of task order that you may need for services, right? That could include materials as well. When you issue a task order, that's when you would then put the four corners of a statement of work together and issue it to a contractor saying, this is the scope of work that I now need you to perform. And you're essentially issuing to them a mini contract. That's really all it is. A task order is a contract in and of itself under a big agreement that you've already agreed to.
Okay, well, back to my house refurbishment. I pull up the carpet and all of this, there's this whole rotten area of floor that I didn't expect. In time and materials, I know how I would handle it. How would you handle that for IDIQ?
Well, you could issue, there's lots of ways you could do it. So a house refurbishment, you could issue a task order to take out the carpet. You could issue a separate task order then to do the performance of laying down new hardwood floors. Or you could elect to do both of those elements together in a single task order and issue a separate task order for other work scopes, maybe bathroom A and kitchen B or something of that nature.
I guess I'm thinking that the separation here is the firm fixed fee, where you've got a very defined scope of work. And in the idea where the task orders are, it's a little bit more nebulous.
So an IDIQ contract can be any type of those. An IDIQ contract, a task order could be a cost plus award fee. It could also be an incentive fee contract, or it could be issued as a firm fixed price contract, right? So having a task order does not narrowly focus you into a certain type of contract. You can still leverage the suite that we have available to be able to perform the work.
And then to Dan's point, then how are you ensuring the defined activity when there could be bad flooring you don't see? Right? So I mean, how are you handling those change orders under a fixed fee contract?
So fixed fee is the question.
Right.
Right, so you're going to follow the change management process just as you would on a normal contract that I think we're more commonly used to, right? The process is no different on a task order than it is on a contract that we're akin to, like the WRPS contract as an example. There has to be a demonstration of a change by the contractor to the government, and then the government follows the review process to determine entitlement and who has, I'll say, culpability, my words, not something that's written in the FAR, or was it known? Is it a different thing that popped up that we did not have insight to when we wrote the four corners of the statement of work? Then you follow that change management process, and those things can be adjusted post-award as necessary following the process. Sure.
Can you comment on what is meant by end state and what an end state contracting model is?
Sure.
There's been some discussion about that in past committee and board meetings. So I think people would be interested in that.
Sure. So end state is, I'll say, maybe a creative way of defining or saying we're setting an outcome, right? So an end state is an outcome that we want to achieve. That's the basic premise of it, right? So the department is defining what outcomes we would like the contractor, and in the Hanford site's case, it's only Central Plateau cleanup contractor that has an end state contract currently. So we're defining an outcome that we want the contractor to achieve by the end of the performance of that task order. So an end state is just an outcome or an objective that we want to achieve.
Is it a little bit like a deliverable?
You could say it's a deliverable. We could tie a deliverable to it, right? So let's see, K-East ISS as an example. That was a recent great accomplishment by the site collectively, right? So the ISS, right, the end state, that's an outcome. Putting K-East into ISS, right, that's an outcome that we achieved. You could tie a deliverable to it and say at the end of it, contractor, please give me a deliverable paper that delineates and defines, or says that you did that, yes. I saw a question over here too.
Yeah. Amongst the other engineers, we basically call IDIQ as indefinite delivery, definite quality. Quality, because these task orders were not managed in the same way as managing the main contract. So now we end up with, say, a $10 billion contract for the big picture, and you're gonna end up having 5, 6 IDIQ packages associated with that, or where they're gonna be doing deliverables. How are they doing it so that the quality is maintained within the contract space?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I think there may be, it may not be clear that a task order has the same rules, requirements, and structure, right? So if you go look up on the hanfordsite.gov and you pull open the WRPS contract, and you're going to see all the sections of the contract, you know, A through J. A task order is exactly the same. It is a contract. It is its own unique and individual contract between contractor and the department.
And this is a contract mod that I would see on that contract?
So, no.
Okay.
So under the IDIQ contract that we have, and let's just use the CPC co-contract as the one to talk about, you will see, if you went onto the contract website, you will see the award of the base contract itself. And then below that, literally, right, looking on the screen, below that, you will see the award of individual task orders. Okay? The award of that individual task order is an award of a new contract under this hierarchical thing that we have up here, right? That task order individually, once you click on that and then go into that, it has all the same parts, bits, pieces, structure, regulations, requirements that a contract has, because it is a contract. So the department's oversight and engagement in the performance of that task order is no different than it is, for example, with the WRPS contract.
Right.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Then, okay, so we've got these 10 years, some $39 billion in contract commitments that I just added up, you know, that's a big chunk of money. But how are you going to factor in inflation over 10 years with the present rate that we have now? I mean, it just means less work's going to be done because they're not going to give us any more money.
Yeah.
Are they?
I can't comment on future
Right.
budgets on that. However, you know, the department does use an escalation as part of our building of budgets. So it is accounted for.
Okay. All right, well, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, it's a little chilly.
It's
Yeah.
pretty in here.
Is it off now?
Yeah.
I'm turning it off, yes.
Yeah.
Judy, did you see that there's 2?
Thank you.
Our side would be nice.
For those online, it's a little Arctic in here, so.
In the CPC co contract, it originally started out with 2 main task orders. One was a task order for operations that basically covered the pump and creeps, well drilling, sampling, analysis, and so on. And then there was a task order for all the other work scope, cleanup work scope. It was in the performance statement of work in the contract. And then they decided to merge the 2, so there's just one task order now covering all of section C in the contract. Why did DOE decide to merge those 2?
I don't know if I could comment today on the specifics of what the decision process was that went into that, but I can state that the determination of the number of task orders and the type of contract, that is an inherently governmental function, so we can make determinations throughout the process with a long period of performance as noted on here through 2029. So in years in the future, we may elect to have multiple task orders to perform the giant section C statement of work, or we can maintain and have one as we currently do now. It kind of just depends on what is in the best interest of the performance of the work that we're doing and how we best feel that that work could be performed.
Okay, and in the contract, there's section D also, which is more level of effort. It covers things like HR, QA, strategic planning, whatever. How was that handled contractually? Because that does not appear in the task order.
So there are elements of it that I would say are covered in the task order. They're part of different clauses that are in the contract relative to the human resources functions that need to be performed by the contractor and just general administrative activities that are necessary to be in place for the performance and support of their employees, right? Whether it be compensation, timekeeping, things of those nature. Those could also be accounted for as part of the contractor's disclosure statement in terms of how they're going to do G&A and overheads to capture those elements.
But they're not captured in the task order.
Well, just because it may not say explicitly you need to pay your people, right? They have to do that to be able to perform the performance of the work scope.
Because it's still in the base contract.
Well, it may be covered in the base contract, but again, a task order is a standalone contract. So everything that we want done within the four corners of that contract does have to be reflected in the contract itself, right? So there is something included. I can't speak to it specifically since I don't have the contract in front of me, but there is something in there that says that they have to do all things necessary to be able to do the performance of the work scope. All things necessary could include the paying of the people, right, ensuring compensation.
Like
and things
all
of-
federal laws and regulations.
Yes,
And
yes,
state and federal
yes,
laws, so
yes, yeah.
it would just be maybe the DOE unique requirements.
Yeah.
Which sometimes show up in the clauses.
Yes, yes. Sure.
How is the safety accomplished through the IDIQ in terms of compensation for safety committee time, PPE, unexpected events, that sort of thing? How is that covered?
So again, how it's done or accomplished under an IDIQ contract, the task order is no different than how it's accomplished under our more traditional contracts that we're akin to, right? A contract is a contract, right? And that's what a task order is. So I can't comment on how PPE or safety committees time are done. Those are things I don't have for purposes of this conversation today, but it should not be different than how it's being done, overseen, or implemented across the board on our other contracts.
It must take a lot of effort to generate these contracts. And your timing puts two of the bigger ones in 2029. You planning for that one?
So currently, the acquisition side of the house is not done, as you probably know, by the Hanford site. We have another arm or element within the environmental management suite, the EMCBC, the EM Consolidated Business Center, that performs acquisitions on behalf of all of the EM team. So there will be planning efforts put in place when the timing is necessary to be able to support those. Okay. Are there comments or questions online potentially?
No, they just signed in this morning for introduction. But taking this moment, if people are online, ready to weigh in with a question or a comment, this is the moment to do it. I'm seeing that.
Well, I appreciate the opportunity today, and hopefully I kind of illuminated some things for you as well, and kind of some clarification that task orders, while may be different, I think the takeaway that I hope you can take with you today is that a task order is a contract, just the same as our other prime contracts are. They're just smaller ones under a larger umbrella.
But it isn't included in the mods, is it?
There are modifications
Right.
that can
I'm
be
familiar
done
with the Bechtel
on
contract.
a task order.
Over and over, yeah.
And David Einen has a comment. Thank you. David, go ahead.
Thanks. Just a quick question. So I want to go back to the change management or changing conditions that were mentioned earlier. We regularly hear, oh, we can't do that. It's not covered by a change. It's not covered by the task order. Particularly, this is pertaining to CPC Co. So it seems like, to be honest, it's being used, the contracting is being used as an excuse rather than, because you say you've got, there's the IDIQ portion, you've got task orders, you've got all these aspects to the vehicle that's supposed to allow the department to respond to conditions. But yet it's like every time it comes up, it's like, oh, we can't do that. It's not in our task order. Am I misinterpreting?
Do you have perhaps an example or something that comes to mind?
Well, for example, there was a sampling and analysis plan for a piece of work, relatively minor piece of work in the Central Plateau that we had been asking for, and we're told, no, it's not in the task order. It's for 200 IA1. It's not in the task order. Well, maybe we can find a way to squeeze it in later. And then you've got, and so it's like, well, maybe next year. Another example is the 324 building, right? Supposedly the task order was to do one thing, and now they're evaluating other things. How is that evaluation has to be covered in contract space? How is that done?
Dave, I think those are very good questions. I can't speak to the technical aspects of those because I'm not involved with those, but from a change management perspective, if there is something that is not in the contract, then there's a process for either the contractor or the government to identify that and work, the opposite way, us to the contractor back to us, to be able to remedy whatever the correct or right remedy may be, to be able to put it in the contract if that's the ultimate determination. So there is a process, both directions, to be able to amend the contract throughout the period of performance as necessary.
Okay.
I do want to go back to your question, sir, relative to modifications. So a task order, again, is a standalone contract, right? So you will see a contract or a task order, on the website. You can then drop down below that as necessary, and throughout the period of performance of that task order, there will be modifications issued against that task order.
Okay.
Right, whether it be a funding modification or something else, it will be a modification to the task order.
So let's put in perspective then, say tomorrow another tank leaks, and the logic tells us that if we spend a bunch of money right now, clean this or do something, put a pump in it or whatever, we can prevent things from happening. How would you allot money to that? Okay, because you don't have emergency funds, you don't have things like that. So how do they fund such an activity that needs to be done relatively quick, probably in the 3 months before the year's out,
So I'll say it's agnostic to whether or not it's a task order or whether it's the traditional contract like we're more commonly used to. If there's something that comes up, the department prefers to issue a request for proposal to the contractor for them to develop a proposal. It comes back and we do that negotiation process, and then we award or modify it onto the contract for performance.
Right.
There are occasions that can transpire where we need to do something a little bit more immediate.
And you have the tools to do that.
We do. There is a process that the government, retains to be able to issue direction to a contractor with, I'll say, a not to exceed amount to start performance of a work.
Okay.
That process can be implemented and is utilized both on, again, I'll say our more traditional contracts that we're used to, right, as well as the same on a task order, because they're simply, at the end of the day, they're both just contracts.
Right. So much of our work here is discovering new things. Okay, we're always finding a new source that we have to act on. And it just thinks that, being flexible there. On the other hand, we need the government control. So I just see when we start negotiating between people, we've been in negotiations for the holistic plan for the site for years. How long can these things go on? And I don't know, there may be a time when expediency is going to control. We'll have to do something.
And the Federal Acquisitions
Regulation.
Regulation, the FAR, I don't know if this is the right term, but they have emergency clauses. So for immediate responses and things like flooding, I mean, there are Army Corps of Engineers, there are processes for items that need immediate attention, and who decides that and how. Rose has a comment, but also Jeff Wyatt just wanted to say, good presentation and questions and answers, and thanks to you. So Rose.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'm kind of curious. I have a couple of just maybe quicker questions because I know that there obviously is some kind of emergency clause because I remember when the tunnel collapse happened that people were like out there on the scene. That was certainly something that nobody anticipated, and so I realize that there must be some kind of emergency clauses, but I'm also aware of the fact that there are things that seem to all of a sudden fall into that black hole that Dave was speaking of as, hey, that's not within our contract, it's not within the scope and whatnot. So I guess my question becomes, who's making those, where is that decision being made? Is it at a local level or does it go back to DC as far as what is deemed an emergency or what is deemed an activity or a situation, if you will, that warrants a modification in the scope of work on the contract or the tasks that are involved in the contract, such as Dave brought up, which I think is a great example of the 324 building, where clearly, there needed to be some modifications that were done. Where are those decisions, those final decisions, where are those coming from? Is that a Brian Vance thing here at a local level, or are those being directed from DC?
You're not going to love my initial reaction, but it depends. Generally speaking, and I'll just put this out there, and then I'll walk it back a little bit. So the only person that has the ability to commit the government is the contracting officer. So at the end of the day, it is the contracting officer that retains the only pen to be able to ink and commit the government. However, so walking back now a little bit, the department utilizes the myriad of subject matter experts that we have that at the local Hanford site that may also include reach back and coordination and communication with our headquarters counterparts to be able to help and inform the decision-making process, right? So it is a myriad of individuals. It is not necessarily a singular person that makes decisions, other than to say the pen to paper that being able to commit the government to anything is the contracting officer. There are occasions where, by our procedures, policies, guidance, or otherwise, we are required to coordinate or submit something to a headquarters element for them to review and give us the approval. Often those are relative or tied to certain delegations that, flow from the White House secretary and down. And so there's sometimes a backwards work where we have to get review and approvals. But again, it's a myriad of individuals based on subject matter expertise and, the mission needs. They give inputs to make a decision on whatever the question is at that point in time.
I'm, and I'm aware that if I just follow up really quickly, I'm aware that obviously not one person is making that decision, and I'm very much aware that obviously there's the contracting officer. That pen to paper is the main authority as far as actually allocating money. I know that painfully well. But even after you've gotten all of these people's input, somebody is telling the contracting officer to sign that paper. Somebody, some entity, I guess, is saying, yeah, we're going to go ahead and choose this. And I mean, and this is important. Speaking for Yakima Nation, it's important. We are in a government to government relationship, with Department of Energy, and our decision makers need to know who is making some of these decisions, especially when they're prioritizing one emergency or one situation over another, where we would maybe request consultation on that as an example. And so I just want you to know kind of a little bit of background why I'm asking this question, because somebody is giving the instruction. And I guess I just want to know at what level these decisions are being made for some of this.
No, I appreciate that. And, maybe what I can offer in response to that for this conversation today is, Brian Vance ultimately is the manager of the Hanford site, right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, Brian Vance is the ultimate person from the decision-making process and ultimately responsible for what happens on the site. Each contract has a line AM or assistant manager that is also responsible for their requisite scopes, right? And generally speaking, there's a line AM tied to each one of these contracts. And so they're an important key or facet to that as well. So hopefully that helps a little bit in the process as well, or in response to your question, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So it is, so what I'm hearing you say, I want to make sure I'm understanding. What I'm hearing you say ultimately is that it is the site manager who ultimately is kind of, is the one who's, and I understand that it may depend on what's going on or what it is, but ultimately it is the site manager who really does have, I guess, the control over some of this more so than anybody else. That's what I'm hearing you say.
I would generally agree with that statement, and he leverages the inputs from his subject matter experts throughout the Hanford organization and his determination or his inputs to make his decisions.
Right. Yeah. No, I would expect that he would call in his folks. Okay, thank you.
There's a question of clarification. The CO is Consolidated Business Center, is that?
No, so the CO that I've been referencing in this discussion with Rose is the contracting officer.
And that's located here, not in
For the current contracts that we have in place today, the contracting officers are all located here at the Hanford site.
Okay, that's what his question was.
Yes,
I misspoke. And then, for example, in terms of procedure, going back to Mr. Einen's question, if an agency decided that it thought it want an amendment to a task order or scope of work was needed, that would be done within the TPA meetings, or how would a request for an amendment for a task order or scope of work be submitted?
Yeah.
Right.
So I think what I'm hearing you ask me is if there's something from, Davian's perspective or whatnot that needs to be amended into, I can't speak for those because I'm not part of any of the TPA dialogue, so I don't want to provide comment on that. But my suggestion would be that those discussions occur with those line organizations as appropriate to be able to cultivate the appropriate discussion about what should or needs to occur.
Thank you. Yes, for more diplomatically responding to what I was saying. All right, any other questions?
Chris, did you have something?
Chris has been
waiting.
The purpose of the end state model and IDIQ contract, one of them is to improve cost efficiency and cost effectiveness in the contracting process. But if your task order is not firm fixed price and they're cost reimbursable or cost plus fee incentive, how does that lead to cost efficiency and cost effectiveness? I would think you'd want them all firm fixed price. I know that's tough to do, but that's how you would get your most efficient work performed, I would guess.
I would say it depends. And it depends comes from the perspective of what type of contract we elect to utilize is informed based on, I'll say, the solidness of the scope of work, right? So if we can delineate or describe a scope of work with absolute certainty, right? That's more akin to allowing us to let a firm fixed price contract, right? Because we know, let's say this room, for purposes of this meeting today, we know with absolute certainty that we do not need any more than what, 6, 7 tables, right? We can say that. Versus if we're just opening it up for, all of the Tri-Cities to attend to it, we may not know how many tables are necessary. So we probably would let a scope of work or a contract that's a firm fixed price contract. We may let a cost plus incentive be as an example, because then the contractor has the ability to earn a requisite fee that's negotiated through the process by potentially, we think it may need 100 tables, and they think they can maybe do it with 75 tables. So there's opportunities to incentivize a contract to promote efficiencies with the other types of contract award instruments as well. It all really is dependent upon the scope and certainty of that scope of work.
And actually, doesn't the FAR also provide some guidance
It
about
does.
what's appropriate for what type of contract? So
Yes.
the federal government says, if you're buying 100 widgets, gosh, firm fixed price might be great. But it does provide big picture guidance for, as a contractor should be.
And that's what we fall back on the route to be able to help us make the most informed decision on the appropriate type of contract. Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's, the department has been encouraging the HAB consider environmental justice. And so I'm wondering, in the contract world, is that being talked about or considered, or do you have a direction?
I don't know, unfortunately, if I can give comments on that today. I can certainly look into it, though. I mean, it is certainly a discussion that's had at the Hanford site and amongst us. I can't articulate how it's been translated to the
But
contracts.
there have been discussions ongoing within your
Yes.
arena.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
And, I'm sorry.
Yes, Steve.
Steve.
I guess along the lines of Chris's comment related to in-scope and fixed fee, and I think, like you mentioned, the ultimate goal is that we know everything, which is why we're gonna let it out. But reality is we don't know everything. We make our best assessment of what scope might be. Do you guys still allow for, or are you okay with reverse auctions as the contractors to their subs? You're familiar with reverse auctions?
I was going to ask you,
right?
maybe explain to me what your perspective is.
Oh, which is when they let out a piece of scope of work and everybody bids backwards on it. Well, I can do it for a little bit less, I can do it for a little bit less, until they're cutting each other's throats. Which has been highly effective from the department's perspective in certain places, but it was really frowned upon in terms of some of your smaller subcontracting folks, because you can see what that does to them.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those occurring. I've heard of them in the past in some of my previous
Yeah, I
lives.
just wondered if that was still.
I'm not familiar with it today. I haven't heard anything. I'm not saying that they're not necessarily going on. I'm not familiar with it.
So, this contract is for a set amount for the 10 years, and they overrun. What do you do?
Which one are you referring
Well,
to?
any of them. I mean, so you've got a contractor with a fixed amount of money and they overrun. And so sometimes you do contract modifications and things of that sort. But when do you penalize them for the overrun? Because they should have noticed it for.
Sure.
I mean, when does that happen?
Yeah, so the government has different tools available to us to be able to incentivize and de-incentivize work, right? And so a couple of those are, we have, on some of these cases, there is a performance evaluation plan or award fee, it's more commonly termed, right? Where at whatever the step frequency is, the department will do a review of that period of performance and provide comment on it, right? And potentially if there's overruns, that'll be an input or factor into what amount is awarded to that pool to the contractor, right? So there potentially could be a reflection of an overrun in that instance. Another tool that the department has at its disposition is the use of what we call CPARs. And sorry, I'm trying to reflect on the acronym for you. It's performance assessment rating. So it's how the government rates a contractor's performance for a period of performance. And the CPARS system, or the tool itself, is used across the federal government, right? And so it's an evaluation of certain things, right? The management, quality, safety, schedule, small business, against rules, requirements, things of that nature. And we evaluate the contractor on their performance, generally speaking, but it can be different on an annual basis. Then that evaluation goes into the system. Contractors are provided opportunity to comment on that, but once it's done, once the government hits the button and says, this is our rating of XYZ contractor for this rating period, it goes into a system that then is now available for all of the government that are currently doing an acquisition to be able to access as part of their evaluation for another contract. So to your point, there's different places where we can reflect that the contractor may have been in an overrun situation.
Okay.
And I do want to note that we have 7 minutes left on this agenda item.
This one actually ended at 9:40.
Bad facilitator. So we're ready to go for a break. And if you have,
Thanks, Ashley.
we're going to be coming back at 5 after. We'll take a short break. It's an 8-minute break and come back and start at 10:05.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here on your last meeting.
Thank you. Yes, and Ashley Morris, our previous presenter, will be contributing to the presentation. Up on the screen is the Hanford Integrated Priorities List, and we'll turn it over to Brian.
All right, thank you. So yeah, for you that don't know me, I'm the director for portfolio planning and optimization with one of the contractors, HMIS, and I do a lot of direct support for DOE. So I was asked today to come and talk you guys through our Hanford Integrated Priority List process. What's up on the screen there was the results of the FY25 process. So understand that as we go through this, we're actually doing forward planning, not planning for execution. So keep that in mind as we go through the presentation and understand what the process is and its utilization. So first off, just to quickly give a little bit of background, the objective of the Hanford Integrated Priority List is to institutionalize a site-wide integrated prioritization process that's underpinned by risk-informed, credible, and consistent information. That way we can ensure traceability and substantiate our mission-critical work scope on an annual basis. So the overall goal here is to develop a hierarchical listing of all of the scope that's required to complete the mission based off of inherent risk to support decision-making. So that's ultimately what our HIPPO process does. The process itself, it starts with defining scoping elements. So we have to define what all the scope is. So we understand how we go about prioritizing it. The process then proceeds with the identification of specific ranking criteria, so risk-informed ranking criteria. I'll go through some of the specifics of what those are here in just a second here. And then the process also then weights each of those individually in order to come up with a summarized ranking of all of the scope here at the Hanford site. The process is done, I'll say, concurrently with the regulatory agencies. So on an annual basis, EPA will go through a process by which they will do an evaluation of the same scope that ecology is doing, as well as DOE, and identifying their priorities based off of those scope descriptions. That process is facilitated by myself and the department. And so we will go through and individually rank the various elements. And then when we're all said and done, again, we'll get a hierarchical listing of each of those ranked scopes. And so that's done with EPA and DOE. It's done with ecology and DOE. DOE also does their own internal one. And then when it's all said and done, we come together as a tri-party and essentially have discussions regarding, where we're in full alignment, where potentially we're a little bit misaligned, if you will, or have different priorities, so that we can have those discussions, understand everybody's position prior to its utilization into the budget formulation process. And so that kind of drives the last aspect here, and the primary utilization of the HIPPO is to support the annual formulation process, annual budget formulation process. So what you'll see up on the screen there, again, it's probably hard for those that aren't in the room that have the handout or that are on the virtually, is the listing of the major programs. So we start our prioritization process identifying those major programs. I'm not going to go through them individually, but as you walk down, there are things like essential functions, waste treatment being DF law, SST retrievals, there's facilities and waste site remediation and risk mitigation actions, our critical infrastructure, so on and so forth. As you can all imagine, there are many lower level details of scope beneath that. And so our process does go to a slightly lower level of detail as we support the budget formulation process to understand specific, what we'll call to be major projects. So again, I'll use tank waste treatment with DF law as an example. You'll see listed there. These are all things to prepare waste as part of waste feed delivery. It includes, TSCR and the operations of TSCR, the effluent treatment facility, all things WTP, including the EMF, the effluent management facility, as well as IDF in terms of disposing of the final canisters into the disposal facility. So as an example, that's how it is further broken down, and those individual projects are also considered for individual ranking, although over time it has been determined that staying at this higher program level has essentially driven a fairly decent and consistent prioritization as we've gone through these processes. I would also like to acknowledge the fact that our process, as it is done annually, does allow for emergent scope to be considered. So obviously, as things are changing, we need to incorporate and consider some emergent activities that may not have been part of your original strategy. And so those are incorporated on an annual basis and I'll say inserted into the process as we go through the prioritization, and then subsequently will feed into the following budget formulation process. So getting into the specific risk criteria, the highest priority here at the Hanford site is personnel risk, making sure that our workers go home in the same condition that they came to every single day. So we place the highest priority on worker risk or personnel risk. The secondary and also very important is the risk to the environment. So any both to the soil and groundwater, but also just to the community and public in general. And then we also consider effects on the overall life cycle. So both cost and schedule impacts, as well as whether or not the scope integrates and affects other programs, not just, I'll say it's kind of singularly executed at the Hanford site. And then we also consider an aspect of technical complexity. And so as we work through and evaluate all of the various scoping activities, we consider which ones I'll say are first of the kind versus routine operations. And what we tend to want to do is be successful in all of our work scope. So if all other risks are equal, we tend to try to lean towards those that we know we can execute and continue to make mission progress. So that's how the process is established on the criteria. So when we do go through the actual process, each of these criteria have a definition, and we apply a number ranking to each of the individual scopes. We attempt to try to come to a consensus amongst everybody about what those ranking sessions or what those rankings are. So we give them a 1, 3, 5 or a high, medium, low if you want to consider it that way. And then as we go through the whole process, each individual scope item then has a score, and at the end we will re-rank it by its weighting factor in the overall prioritization. And then the back end of that process also allows us to then go do, I'll say, a sanity check. Did everything come out as we had anticipated? As you go through this process, you can understand that is quite a lengthy process. So oftentimes your thought process or the headspace that you're in when you started is different than when you were ranking ones at the end. And so it's just kind of a double check as we go through that process to make sure that, you know, everything is as we would expect it, and that the prioritization is consistent with what the agencies for theirs, as well as DOE when they finish theirs, reflects their actual prioritization. So like I said, this here up on the screen is the FY25 results. It's ranked obviously from, if you want to consider it, there's no numbers on here, but it's from top to bottom is the prioritization. So there are essential functions that we have to perform. And again, as part of the prioritization process, we actually don't rank these essential functions. They're just assumed that they have to be funded because it is necessary just to maintain, you know, the safe work environment out on site. And then as we walk through them, we have DF law, the tank waste treatment. So in anything that supports the treatment of tank waste supernate through DF law, including any secondary waste that's generated from that, and then ultimately the final disposal. We also continue to run and support the groundwater pump and treat operations and other remediations supporting groundwater to ensure the protection of the Columbia River. Along those same lines, we still have a focus on the river corridor cleanup and finishing that due to its proximity to the river. Waste disposition is, I'll say, kind of a general term, but essentially that is ensuring that any waste that we generate is ultimately safely stored and or final ultimate disposal as necessary. So obviously some of our stuff will not be disposed of here in Washington State. It will be disposed elsewhere. And so this also considers all of the necessary scope in order to prepare and ship that waste to the final disposal facilities. Continuing down, SST retrievals, obviously in order to continue to generate waste, in order to treat it at WTP, we will continue to need to do SST retrievals. We then have a focus on addressing the aging facilities. So a lot of our facilities obviously were used as part of the production back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And now no longer have a mission, benefit or a direct mission benefit. So as we receive funding and as we evaluate, again, worker risk on potential degradation to any of those facilities, some of those will raise to the level of getting prioritization funding. We have to ensure that all of the things that enable everything above there still are running and available to everybody. So the critical infrastructure includes the water and sewer processes, as well as the electrical distribution, IT, roads, so on and so forth. And so those scopes, as well as projects to continue to provide those services come next there. And then we transition our focus to what we call here the remaining tank waste treatment. So in other words, high level waste treatment. So we'll continue to work towards the complete integrated WTP and treating all tank waste. Subsequent to that, and also included there is the tank farm closure aspects of things. So once we retrieve all of the waste to the requirements, we will then ultimately landfill close all of the tank farm areas, waste management areas. So that's the second to the last item. And then the last item on here is obviously to continue to achieve the decision documentations, which then will ultimately drive field remediation throughout the Hanford site. And primarily here, we're focused on the Central Plateau decision documents.
I have two questions on this integrated priority list. The first one, has this ranking, let's say, from essential functions down to Central Plateau decision documents, has that changed much over the past few years, or has this been essentially constant for a fair bit of time?
It's been fairly constant. So I've been involved in this process for the last 5 years, and it's been essentially constant. throughout. Now, one also must consider that just because it's ranked number 3 on here does not mean that every single scope item that is underneath that will ultimately be prioritized. And so this is the highest level of programs that support the overall Hanford mission, support worker and environmental risks going down the list. And so as this feeds into the budget formulation process, obviously some of those things can be affected by other things besides just risk, but from a risk perspective, these have stayed pretty consistent.
And then my second question was, in the budget formulation process, is the implication, let's say that the tank waste treatment DFLAW should get priority funding over the tank farm closure? And is that how it feeds into the budget formulation process?
That is how it would feed into it. But then, again, there's not a direct linkage necessarily that just says you're not going to do anything closure-wise. If that's what
But
you're
there's a
trying to get
generic linkage.
at. That is correct.
Okay.
And then, Ashley, do you want to add into this conversation?
If I need to throughout, I will.
Okay,
Thank
great. Thank you. Are there other questions or comments? Do you have more to present? Why don't we go through the-
Just the utilization and some key takeaways. So
Okay.
as I had mentioned, the primary focus of the Hanford Integrated Priority List, the HIPL as we call it, is to support the annual budget formulation process. And so as I had indicated earlier, these are the FY25 prioritizations. Obviously, we're not in FY25. So as we start going through this process again this fall with the regulatory agencies and DOE, we will be looking at ranking those scope items to support the FY26 budget formulation process come the beginning of the next calendar year. So again, this process is intended to be proactively evaluating those scope items by which we should be requesting funds in order to continue to drive our risk reduction position within DOE. It is also used, not directly, but indirectly, it is used for the fiscal year work planning. So as I indicated, this is more the foresight. So obviously, as this feeds into budget formulation and ultimately that formulation is appropriated, then that appropriation then goes into execution. And so the HIPL does feed into the discussions between DOE and the contractors on that execution priority, but it is not directly driving those priorities because there are other things like contract requirements that force some other scopes within those bounds to be authorized within a given fiscal year. As we work through execution, the HIPL process is also used to inform some opportunities due to efficiency. So if we realize that we're doing things quicker or within less funding, we can authorize other work scope to move forward. And so this is a tool that is also used to then evaluate what is that work scope that may have not been, above the line, if you will, from a prioritization perspective for initial funding, but then is next in line as that funding does become available. And then the last thing here is we ensure that the HIPL is aligned to the overall EM program strategic plan. So there's an EM strategic vision and an EM program plan by which the prioritization schema that they use is also influenced into our HIPL process. So there's also I'll say, a DOE-wide linkage between our HIPL process and that across all of EM.
Well, there went my next question.
Yes, how is the 5-year plan formulated out of this, or is it the other way around? How do those two things work, or do they work together?
They do work together. So the HIPL is I'll say the first cog in establishing the site strategic plan, by which then that informs budget formulation. As the budget formulation process is completed internally and submitted to OMB for their consideration, that information then feeds into the Hanford Site 5-year plan. And so the 5-year plan then, in essence, is informed by the HIPPL going into the budget formulation process and the prioritization of scope, and then subsequently the allocation, if you will, by fiscal year is determined within the budget formulation process. But that's an embargoed process that we're not going to get too much into today.
Do they use these same risk-informed factors?
That is correct. Yeah, they use the HIPPL,
The HIPPL 5-year, or the HIPPL risk-informed factor.
they use the HIPPL ranking as an input into the development of the 5-year plan.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
So do you have any final points on your presentation?
Just key takeaways.
Yeah.
So the 3 key takeaways here. First off, we have a risk-informed prioritization tool that does inform our budget formulation process. It's updated annually to align to our strategic goals as well as EM's strategic goals, and allows for the capture of emergent scope due to that annual evaluation. And we do solicit and incorporate regulatory input on an annual basis into this process. So those were the key takeaways that I wanted to communicate to you guys all today.
Great, thank you. And for agency perspectives, we have Neil Cottle from Ecology. And Neil, I saw you on the call. Do you want to unmute?
Sure. Thank you, everybody. So, hi, I'm Neil Cottle from Ecology's Nuclear Waste Program. And so I appreciate the opportunity to participate in the discussion. From our perspective, we understand that this is part of DOE's process when setting the budget. This is something that we have participated in the past, and we do plan to continue to participate in. Funding priorities are important, and we do remain committed to working with DOE and EPA on this issue. Some of the categories and details of the process are things that we don't really understand very well, but we're learning as we go through this, and we use this opportunity to express our priorities and establish a dialogue with DOE. Ultimately, we think that the best reflection of priorities are the milestones in the tri-party agreement, and that those milestones are the things that should form the backbone of what priorities and funding levels should be. We do think that the HIPPL should not undermine that process, but it can provide DOE with a secondary supplemental information source when setting priorities and requesting funding. So again, appreciate the opportunity and look forward to continuing to participate in this in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. And with EPA, Mr. Iron, do you have any comments, or do we have a different representative?
Nope, it's me again. I'm Daving, and I think I know most of y'all. And I will echo what Neil said, that appreciate being part of the process. We also agree that we express our priorities through milestones. And you'll note that in the presentation, the tri-party agreement and the milestones were not mentioned, right? And I'll be honest that our input to the last year's HIPPL was, this does not serve our purposes. This does not meet the needs of, or the intent of paragraphs 148 and 149, where we're supposed to be having those priority discussions. And so we need to make improvements for this to be worthwhile. Couple of other concerns with the HIPPL is it doesn't reflect budget control points and the finer aspects of scope. Like, so Brian did mention that, within any given scope there, some things are maybe priority and other things not, and that's absolutely true. So when you look at that big block, it doesn't tell the whole story. And I will also say that several Brians have committed to helping us work through improving the process for this year. Both Stickney, Esparza, and Harkins have all said, yes, we will work with EP and Ecology to make improvements. So I'm looking forward to that. And again, appreciate the opportunity to offer comments and participate. Thank you.
Great, thank you for raising past concerns and the update that there will be greater collaboration going forward. There is a comment online about, is there a report where you can see how the items are prioritized or scored? Do you have like this, I guess that's like the scoring worksheet. Jeff, do you want to open your mic?
No, that is my question. I mean, this is a nice list, but I would like to see how individual items on here compare to one another. So is there a report or something we could reference?
There is not a specific report that is generated as part of the process. The process ultimately produces an internal spreadsheet, which is then offered as part of the budget formulation, again, internally, in order to go through those various scoping elements as they work through identifying the required budget for the elements that are going to be prioritized. And so that's an internal DOE process. And so that there isn't a specific report by which those are published.
But there is a spreadsheet.
There is a spreadsheet generated.
There's a worksheet that's.
So I guess we just need to formally request the spreadsheet. View that. Is there any problem with that?
I don't know if I can comment on that at this point. I don't
Right, it's just something
engage
to
as
take
much
down
on
in
the
notes.
HIPAA side of the park, but if it is part of the formulation process, it's not something that we can share through formulation, right? We'll comment on budget once the PBR is issued. President's budget request, excuse me.
Now, is that something, David, that you're in negotiation trying to do, I guess, Neil? Are you aware of the spreadsheet where the HIPAA has the numbers, the HIPAA or whatever? Is that part of the negotiation elements? Because I'd really love to see, you know, your alignment from the regulators, both Neil and David, how they differ and where there are areas that you have concern from the tri-party agreement or.
It sounds like there's a bigger, let's go back to this, because if I heard this right, the sheet that we are just looking at is for the 25 priorities, right?
That's correct.
And maybe I missed this, but as you start to work on the 26 priority list and this ranking and the working with the TPA, going back to what Mr. Iron just spoke about, do you want to talk, can you talk about the process a little bit? Like what's the timing? How does this evolve, or when are the target dates that you're working for with different pieces of this?
I can continually give you a schedule because
Big
obviously,
picture.
yeah, because obviously, so we reached out in August, mid-August, to get a list again of participants from each of the regulatory agencies with the intent that this fall, and you know, we're now getting towards fiscal year end, and so likely it's going to be the October-November timeframe, which is consistent with previous years. We will sit down and go through the spreadsheet prioritization process with each of those agencies individually. And so that's, like I said, depending on scheduling and everything, that's in the October-November timeframe. Concurrent with that, we are also in the November-December timeframe working through that internally so that DOE also has their own individual, so that we can come together in January to all have those discussions to then feed into the formulation process, which is nominally at the end of January, February of every year. So those are general timeframes.
And is that consistent, David, with your understanding?
Yes.
Okay, great, thank you.
But in October-November timeframe, the 5-year plan update is going to be released, and it will have work scope for FY26 and possibly FY27. But you're saying that that 5-year plan then won't include, when it comes out here in October, November, the latest update for FY26, you will not have constructed or agreed upon the integrated priority list for FY26, even though work scope will be in that 5-year plan update.
Correct. Due to the review timeframes on the data set and the communication itself on the Hanford Site 5-year plan, it is based off of the FY25 when it comes out in October. And then we will start the process that will go through the FY26 HIPPL development, formulation, and then we'll use that information to update the Hanford Site 5-year plan again, and that's what will come
For the
following
previous,
October.
for next year.
Correct. So the process is cyclical in nature, if you will. It's just, timing wise, it trails itself essentially. So when you see the Hanford Site 5-year plan and it is communicating the FY25 HIPPL through the evaluation of and consideration of budget formulation into a data set that is evaluated by portfolio, looking at the entire life cycle, and then that's what generates that graphic by which then you go through a series of contractor DOE reviews, headquarter reviews before it gets finalized to send to the public, and that's when you see it come in the October timeframe. So it's using data essentially from April when it comes to you guys in October.
Is it, following up on that, is it fair to say that the 5-year plan, sets the goal over 5 years, but the priority list each year kind of refines what that work will be for that particular year?
That's a correct statement.
Right.
So it's still informed by the HIPPL. HIPPL still informs every single one of the year activities there, as well as it went into the formulation and you're looking at out years. You're not just looking, when I say FY26 formulation, the formulation is not looking just at 26, it actually has a 5-year window. And so it's looking at the whole 5-year plan. I mean, it's that whole window that goes into the formulation process.
Well, what, if any, role does the Hanford Advisory Board budget advice play in this?
I would assume that it's considered. I haven't seen anything specific on it directly in my realm, but maybe more of a question for.
Well, I would just say generically, the department conducts different priority outreach engagements right throughout the process, and there is the opportunity for the public to provide comment on our priorities through that process.
So, I mean, annually in the 5-year plan, that has a 30-day public feedback period by which that information is received. We do consider it as we're working through this process because we will be working through the FY26 process as we receive input on the 5-year plan. So there's that linkage still too, where we do get public input into it and would include HAB input.
In being new to this, is that an item that would come to one of the board meetings or a committee meeting?
As far as their.
When the priority list has been developed as part of the public comment?
So
This is the first time since I've been on the HAB that we've seen the integrated priority list.
So as far as their advice, that usually comes to a full board meeting.
Okay,
For approval.
great.
And then, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I got several points here. I'm amazed that you have not seen our advice from the board on the priorities, and you didn't know it existed. But we have issued advice on our priorities, and they should be going not just to DOE, but they should be going to our contractors. Why not? Anyway, that's one surprise. A couple other things about your data sheet, and then I'll ask some more. Is that the implication here on SST retrievals, and I think it's just an editorial thing, is your implication is you're going to put it in a new tank. We're not building new tanks yet. No. So you should scratch the word and just say into safer double shell tanks, because it's not new. There's nothing new out there.
Correct.
Yeah. The second thing is this is some of the first times we've actually seen in print where considerations for grout filling single shell tanks. So I think we should all be aware that it's now on paper. Okay, the two other questions I have for this is, you talk about risk-informed decisions. Risk of what? Risk of not accomplishing it? Risk of running out of money? Risk of, to us at Hanford, as the board, we're thinking radiation risk, personal safety risk, risk of contamination reaching the groundwater. There's a ton of different risks, and it's pretty simple just to say, we look at it from the standpoint of risk, And in many cases, if you take a look at some of the documents that we've had, it's risk of completing the contract. You know, so if you're saying, well, we can complete this contract, it doesn't matter what the contract does. It's really, you know, it just seems like you need to define what you mean by risk and how you consider these factors, because there are multiple factors in it. And then the third thing that I did want to ask, and this is more for Ashley maybe. So when we have these problems like with our getting products to us, you know, we call it our supplier chain thing, and we have things like a melter that's $32 million or $300 million melter being built. It's going to take 4 years to build. On an annual basis, how are you holding back that money? Is it simply an accounting thing that's done here on the project and the real money's elsewhere? Or I just don't quite understand how, when we end up with multi-year procurements in particular, when we're out there, and I use the melter as a good example because it's a melter. And how do we hold that money back? You know, because it's allotted, you're going to spend this many $1 million, it's allotted in 1 year, or do you allot it in segments in every year? Then what's the guarantee, the continuation for the next year that you're going to get the money, that somebody hasn't rated it? Those are the kind of confusing things that I see because I've experienced it. You know, we've experienced where, oh, we don't need money to do that. We spent it already. You know,
Ashley, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I will, and I may look to you to talk a little bit on work plan and how it's formed potentially a little bit, but this ties to your question a little bit that we were chatting on the break a little bit. So the department does make our requests, right, through the formulation process, and then eventually we, excuse me, we have a budget, right, that we're working. We are appropriated X amount for a year. The department's money, and I don't necessarily think it would be helpful for us today to get into the nuances of this, but the department's money that we are appropriated is called no year money, right? So in the DoD world, simplistically, much of their money, not across the board, but much of their money is 1 year appropriations, meaning it's given to them given it to them in a year that also has to be then spent in that same year. The department in general here at Hanford does not have that restriction, so we receive our money in a year and it can be carried over for multi-years for use, right? So that's something that helps to enable us in the performance of our work, because we do have things that happen like you've outlined with the melter. So taking a different kind of right turn in this conversation a little bit, when the department or when appropriations are made, right? We'll just say for FY27, we'll pick a pie in the sky. We receive an appropriation of $20 billion, right? We don't receive $20 billion on day one of the fiscal year, right? It's not given to us that way. We receive apportionments throughout the fiscal year of that money. We then apportion it or incrementally fund our contractors, and that's the modifications to our earlier conversations where you'll see a funding mod to put on incremental funding. We then fund the contractor incrementally to do the performance of that scope that we have agreed to for that fiscal year, right? So there's a lot of different elements that go into your situation that allow us, I'll say it this way, to be able to provide or ensure funding to cover the work scope that we've agreed to with the contractor, right? And that does have an accountability process, also allowing us supply chain impacts, right? To be able to mitigate those from a funding perspective, because again, we're incrementally funded, right? And so we're not receiving everything up front and then we just have to like figure it out in the back of our mind and we need to hold back. It's kind of a self-writing process a little bit. So there's different elements that go into helping ensure that we have the funding available to ensure performance of the mission, right? Okay.
Brian, do you want to add anything in on that?
I don't think I need to, no.
Okay, thank you. It gets very complicated, and I think you're doing a fabulous job of reflecting federal funding.
How big is your department?
The organization that I'm a deputy to, we have approximately 80 federal individuals on our team, and then we have also contractor support staff.
And you think we're all in good hands?
I think we have a very good team, to say it this way.
Oh, that's good.
Great people that are dedicated civil servants to be able to support the mission. Yeah.
Good to be proud of.
Yeah.
That's good. Thank you.
Are there other comments, questions? Go ahead, Chris.
So in the establishment of risk and how you prioritize it, typically at the lowest level at which work is performed, let's say at the cost account level, periodically, sometimes every year, sometimes every other year, we have to complete a risk register at the lowest level at which work is done. And that risk register for various tasks that a group is responsible for, they have to, on this risk register, it says, if there are problems, is this going to result in a cost overrun, a schedule delay, and if so, how much of each? And based upon that, a risk is established. And then this rolls up to, say, a division level. Do you work off those risk registers to establish DOE's risk internally?
I specifically do not, but there is an enterprise level risk management plan that does address exactly what you're talking about, which is you're speaking to execution and project level risk, which then roll up to a program, which then roll up to the overall Hanford site, which then technically roll up to an EM risk, because some of our risks also we don't have any control over, like WIP's availability or something else like that.
But that roll up of risks that I just described and you just described, that's not the same as the risk that goes into the integrated priority list.
The same types of risks are considered. So a risk register is developed at the project level by the contractors.
Right.
Right. So when we get into advanced planning, we're not looking at execution level risks. And I won't get in too much into but you also can't request funding for contingency. And so while that risk register is important in order to ensure that your project understands what risk it can experience, we have allowed, you essentially have to allow the contractors to then abide by what has been appropriated within those specific projects. And then subsequently, that's going to roll up to a level. So we qualitatively evaluate that on an annual basis as we develop our environmental liability and other things like that that must be communicated by the department. But it is not a direct linkage of project level risks to the specific risks that we use in order to inform the HIP. So I mean, we don't get to that level of granularity of, let's say, waste acceptance criteria not met by a specific waste batch.
Could I just ask, for this priorities list, you spoke about risk in 4 different categories. Do you just want to quickly repeat those 4 risk categories?
The primary risk category is personnel risk. So that's risk of radiological, chemical, structural degradation, whatever you name it, to the workers themselves. That's the highest level of risk. Then you have environmental risks. So now that's, in many cases, it's the same radiological and chemical risk, but now it's what is that potential to affect the environment? So the soils, the groundwater, and then even a public release of such. The third one is mission level risks, so life cycle risks, cost and schedule wise. So essentially that is built into what you've just described, although each contractor manages within their own contract those risks that then roll up to those higher level ones. And so that would be technically considered, but not directly within the life cycle risk impacts. And then there's the technical complexity risk.
Okay, thank you. All right, sorry, did someone else have their hand up? I thought it'd be helpful to refresh on that. Anyone online? So under speaking points, are you able to share those that you walk through, or?
Not at this time.
Okay, gotcha. And these highlights from the conversation, Josh has been taking notes, so if you want to walk through, you know, the key points of the presentation, they'll be listed, for example, the 4 categories of risk that are associated with the prioritization list. So you'll be able to read the flow through, the timeline that was provided, that'll all be in the notes. A lot of information, well presented, thanks for the clarifications. Also, if there are no other items.
I think Chris had his hand up.
Oh, did you? Sorry.
Yeah, one last thing. And this kind of goes to what Rob Davis was alluding to a few minutes ago. But every year, the HAB puts out an advice to the tri-party TPA agencies on what they consider the work priorities ought to be for work to be performed 2 years in advance to fit the budget cycle. So this fall, the HAB will kick off a work start formulating the advice for FY26 work priorities. And it will start in the October, November timeframe. We'll say a goal of issuing that advice, let's say next February, because that's when we have a board meeting and the board has to consensually approve that advice. But you won't have completed the integrated priority list for FY26. And so we're not really going to know what DOE or the tri-party agencies feel that the work priorities are for FY26, yet we're advising on advice. We have used the 5-year plan as a basis for that advice, at least for the past 3 or 4 years. And when it comes out, the update in October, November, presumably that will be used as one basis for our advice. But again, we won't know what the FY26 integrated priority list is because you said it probably won't be complete until April. So it seems to me that there's a mismatch, inherent mismatch in what we're advising, because we don't know what DOE or the tri-party agencies consider work priorities to be really. And yet we're using something that may be a little out of date as a basis for our advice.
I'd ask David Einan also if he can speak to this at all. David, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, good point, Chris. And I think what we will use, I don't think you need to know what we're thinking at the moment, because what we, as you know, we hear what you're doing and we observe that, and you provide advice, and that all gets rolled up at the end. And we consider your advice, both current year, past years, as we try and reflect those in our priorities as well. So that communication then gets to be part of the conversation for sure. And so we're always considering that advice and those priorities as we incorporate ours. And having that come together in that January, February timeframe still works in allowing the department to consider as they formulate their budget request. Again, because that is the department's, that is uniquely theirs, and we can give information, but what they do with it ultimately is up to them.
And for the department, we have our priorities, but that FY budget, or I'm sorry, cleanup priorities advice, we're looking for what the Hanford Advisory Board's priorities are.
In a way, Chris, if you saw that advice, and I'm speaking way out, so I'm setting my facilitator role aside and saying, this is what I think I'm hearing. If you have somebody who's already prepared advice, you've got something that's already kind of baked, right? You want that input, really before that list comes out, because of what Mr. Einan is saying, tri-party agencies are saying, here's what's important to us. We'd like to know what the members think are important, and then all of that goes into helping inform the list. So you could look at it either way. It's a matter of input earlier in the process or input later in the process. And with that,
and to some extent, to some extent, it's important, you know, I don't want to just have an echo chamber of, okay, this is what EPA is thinking or DOE is thinking or whatever. We need to be hearing from you all as well in terms of what you're thinking. So there's a certain independence from the HAB that I appreciate, right? Those are the voices that aren't in the room every day. So that's why it's important that we hear those.
Rob, Brian, did you want to?
I was just gonna say, timing wise, I mean, you're essentially also concurrently doing your own prioritization that can get funneled in. That's still going to be available and support any of the decisions that go into the actual budget formulation process. And so timing wise, I don't see that that's an issue, just because you're developing the priorities before the department and the regulatory agencies have final stamped theirs. They're still adamantly or intimately in the middle of their process too. It's just another piece of information that can support the overall decision-making process.
But you don't see our advice, right? You haven't seen it in the past?
I don't do budget formulation.
No,
I
I'm
have no
talking
input
about,
into budget
I'm talking
formulation.
about work priorities.
I have seen stuff come from you in work priorities, yes. And again, I had tagged that off of the 5-year plan, assuming that that's where that advice was coming off of, was the 5-year plan. So I didn't make the direct linkage or indirect linkage, if you will, into the HIPPL and the formulation process.
I'm going to ask a question for clarification. So that 25 priorities list, is that DOE's priority list for 2025?
This is the final.
This is the final that went into it.
That's correct. So this is, DOE's was separate, EPA and Ecology all did theirs. We came together, had the discussions. This is the result of all of those discussions, including and considering everybody's input.
Okay, thank you.
How many years ahead do you look?
So
Because many of these projects will be, each one of these items are gonna take more than 1 year.
Correct.
And within that next year or the second year, it may change its position.
Understood.
And the staff.
That's correct.
Okay, so this is my suggestion. Maybe we think about modifying our advice to be more generic. And meaning that because we have such a difficult time getting our presentations, and we're only gonna meet so many different times to have presentations on the issues. Maybe ours could be a rolling 2-year priorities advice or something like that sort, where we factor in the fact that not all these are going to get done in 1 year. Okay, and our priorities are really not going to change very much.
Why don't you hold that, Rob? Because the very last thing that we want to do in this committee meeting for the last 40 minutes or so is to talk about is there a better way to issue our advice, a better way to do it, and I think that would be a perfect opportunity to bring this up.
So that is a beautiful seg. I am mindful of time, trying to make sure that I'm on time. We have 4 minutes left. This is a conversation that can unfold and be unpacked a little bit further in the day. Are there any other questions right now while we have Ashley and Brian in the room? Anyone at all?
No, I'd like to use them as resources again.
Okay.
I mean, definitely. We've established this relationship and now we'll go from here.
You only had me today, sorry.
Ashley.
I just kidding.
Well, with that, we will break for lunch, come back at 12:30. We've already communicated with our afternoon speaker, and they're prepared to come on.
12:30.
David Bowen, he's going to be logging on a few minutes before, and that will be discussing the Hanford budget, which will be informative again to what the committee business is after that and what type of advice you might want to be recommending. So we'll break and see you all at 12:30.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ashley. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
No, I meant for,
David Bowen
they'll do that, they'll send it out. Yeah, someday.
from Ecology
You'll get it before he comes back.
is going to be presenting on efforts to enhance the budget for the Hanford site. After that, we'll hear agency perspectives and then conclude with questions, discussion, and feedback from committee members. Thank you for joining us today, David, and we are ready for you to start.
Awesome, thank you. I apologize for any background noise. I found the quietest spot I could in the airport, so hopefully this works okay. So I understand my assignment was there's some interest in finding out, I've got an echo, of course. Fix that. Are you hearing an echo on your end?
Attention office, there's attention office, USFS, Jennifer, USFS, Jennifer, 3666.
The echo too.
TSA 60 checkpoint. You left your phone.
I took out one piece and I'm better now, so I'm gonna go ahead and start rolling. Let me know if it's in the chat, if it's overwhelming.
Everybody.
So appreciate the opportunity. Got an overview of our efforts associated with the Hanford budget this afternoon. Oh, sure.
We're getting some background noise and we're working on muting that. Do we think we have it?
I think
You
that
mute everybody, then he's got to turn his on.
No, we don't. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, I think we're ready. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I know there's background noise here too, but I'm working on it as best I can.
Yeah.
So, I think the first thing on budget is I want to thank all the organizations and individuals who joined in writing the president and our congressional delegation. Speaking in one voice was very powerful here in DC, and definitely an ongoing team effort and a leap of faith to trusting each other as we went into this. So I'll give it a thumbs up from Liz. Sound is better. All right. We have great partners in the governor's office, Senator Murray, Senator Cantwell, Representative Newhouse, and all of the Washington delegation, to be honest. So it's been a real pleasure to actually get back to DC and have those conversations and find out just how much people know about Hanford and how much they care about it. I know during our regular HAB meetings, I've mentioned one of our efforts is a focused strategy advocating for appropriate Hanford funding. And I think the question for me today was to add some detail around how that strategy developed and what's been accomplished, where we're heading, that type of thing. So I'll try and go into that. Some of you HAB members are new, so I became the nuclear waste program manager in December of 2020. And honestly spent most of 2021 learning, absorbing, and making connections. And during that time, it became increasingly clear that disagreement was really on about 5% of what we were doing, typically centered around legal interpretations from each of our unique perspectives. And the other 95% was about safe, efficient, and cost-effective cleanup. We could all agree on that. And we'd had, some differences in sequencing of activities and that type of thing. But overall, a good portion of the work was we had agreed on. That's not what you would see in the news, and it was became really clear we needed to address that. I think the January 2022 life cycle report talking about $300 to $600 billion left for cleanup was the moment I realized everyone knows the costs associated. Generally in agreement regardless of how the waste is treated and properly disposed, whether you're talking about grout or vitrification or whatever it might be. The idea was to retrieve, treat, and properly dispose of the waste. So capital facilities obviously need to be built. Infrastructure needs to be in place to transport. Our permitting has to be expedient, and we need to communicate that to people making funding decisions. And we need to do that if we're going to have any hope at all of getting this waste treated and properly disposed of. So, and right now it's appearing as though it's going to be 2070s when this is done. If we want to get this done in this century, we need to be acting now to get those capital facilities projects up on and online. We, as the ecology director, Charlotte Mena and myself, the governor's office, we started making visits to DC in March and May of 2022. We stopped with everybody who would talk to us, whether it was senators, representatives, Energy's headquarters, Office of Management and Budget, Operations Committee staff in the House and Senate, and staff in the White House. During that time, we developed several one-page handouts, such as what is Hanford, Hanford budget, clean up Hanford, and some visuals on what's been accomplished along with what still needs to be done. So we made those rounds in 2022, and there was a real common theme once again, the unified voice. Hold on a second. Announcement in the background.
Subject to search, inspection, damage, and removal. Do not accept items or packages.
You sound like you're in an airport.
Surprised I am. I'm just getting ready to fly back from DC to Seattle via Portland. All right. So a common theme was that need for unified voice that I mentioned earlier. It needs to come from the community. It needs to come from energy, ecology, Washington State, tribes, stakeholder groups. Without a unified vision, our representatives in DC struggled to make the argument for funding. So we took that feedback to heart. We engaged with the governor's office to hold a roundtable discussion on our Richland office. I think it was June 2022. And we did that so we could both hear everyone out and ask for help while creating a unified message. The governor also joined a tour of Hanford later in that day, along with additional folks who weren't at the roundtable. The idea for a message focused on budget, a topic we could all agree on regardless of who we represent, came from those meetings in coordination with the governor's office. TRIDEC and David Riplog took the first crack at a draft of the letter. And honestly, there were very little changes to what David originally put together in a draft. We circulated that draft to the attendees of the roundtable and the tour, asking for signature, and ultimately ended up with 12 entities signed on, and Yakima Nation sent a letter mirroring our correspondence at the same time. That was kind of the kickoff on the unified voice and getting that idea rolling. Next thing we did while we were working on the letter, there were news articles and social media posts supporting Hanford funding began circulating. King 5 ran a Hanford funding story. CAP, KView, Tri-City Herald, the Northwest Public Broadcasting, and others ran their stories. Many of you have seen those stories and commented on them, so we're getting the message out. Governor Inslee wrote directly to OMB, Office of Management and Budget, regarding a decreased request in the president's budget, because the president's budget came out and it was actually less than the 2022 ask, and we were rather surprised by that. TRIDEC and others worked in their circles, and the end result was an amendment increasing the president's budget ask to $2.71 billion, which was above the previous year's request. So that was for the 2023 budget. That kind of a change in the president's budget doesn't happen often, and it was because of the work that we all did, and it was huge for visibility of the need at Hanford. Following that, the entire Washington delegation sent a letter to the White House in October of 2022. The Environmental Council of the States, which is an organization that Director Watson sits on, along with Energy Communities Alliance, wrote to OMB and the White House on the same matter and raised the same issue, not just at Hanford, but across the entire complex. So it was for all the sites across the United States, and we're down to 15 of those sites right now. So it's important that they all get done. It's important that we're not pilfering dollars from their cleanup to fund Hanford cleanup. And the messaging was really to boost overall Hanford for environmental management across all the sites. So as we finished our visits in 2022 and realized just how we really needed a consistent presence in DC, we put together a request for proposals to acquire federal advocacy services. And we did that in November. And then After we received 4 responses, after review and scoring of those responses, we did end up selecting BNF Solutions to coordinate our federal advocacy efforts, and they came on board in March of 2023. With their assistance so far in 2023, early on, we filed programmatic requests specific to Hanford funding with the Washington delegation. At that point in time, it was $3.76 billion, which represented the scheduled work to meet existing milestones for work at Hanford. We flew to DC for meetings in March, April, June, and then now in September. Director Watson, Deputy Director Bartlett, along with Special Assistant Mina, went on 2 of those, and then I went on 2 of them as well. Responded to proposed amendments that could have been detrimental to progress over that time as well. There was some language introduced that would have derailed some of our discussions between EPA, ecology, and energy, and we managed to subdue those for now. That's the main thing we've done to in DC. In between those visits, though, and throughout the last 2 years, we continued communication between the Energy's headquarters and Energy Hanford to be sure there was no misunderstanding on the nature of our efforts. We did the same thing with TRIDEC and with Hanford Communities and other folks as we were working this issue. We do work with our partners across the complex on the Federal Facilities Task Force, which I'm a member of, to be sure we were working to raise all boats, not take the limited funding from other sites. And as I mentioned earlier, it's important work across the country. It all needs to be accomplished in a safe, effective, and efficient manner to reduce long-term costs. So going forward, everyone's efforts are paying off. The 2024 budget was a record $3 billion at Hanford. The delegation has a unified vision to point to as they advocate for funding. And we have our fingers on the pulse of DC through BNF Solutions, the Governor's Office, and Department of Energy. With that said, there is more to do. If you go back to the life cycle cost report and the analysis of alternatives documents released in the last year, look at the scope of work needed to meet milestones in the tri-party agreement. We know there is an upcoming approximately $2 billion spike in capital project expense coming from during the 2025 to 2030, 2032 timeframe. Our advocates in DC are aware, and we are preparing to contribute in making that lift. And this is $2 billion on top of the $3 billion, and it isn't going to be easy. So, I just came out of a meeting with appropriations, and part of the message was to, it's things that absolutely have to be done. If there's something that can be prioritized and mothballed for a bit and done later, they want to know what that is. So we've got our work cut out. It's all important work, but those capital facilities need to get online if we're going to get anywhere near completion in the 2070s or so. And they need to run in parallel. They can't go consecutively. It just extends the treatment time cycle by decades if they go consecutively rather than in parallel. Trying to see, I had one last thing written down here, and it's not making sense as I read it. So Hanford is the largest site, and we'll be last to finish as the other 14 sites wrap up their efforts. We're going to lose people vested in EM funding. We need to have something fully baked to keep Hanford on track. And we really feel like this next 3 to 5 year window is the most critical window we have to get Hanford done on time. So that's a nutshell version of what we've been doing the last 2 years on Hanford budget and advocacy. And I'm going to end there and see, I think the other agencies are going to make some comments, and then I'm here for questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that presentation and recap. Do we have an agency perspective from DOE?
I can add a couple comments if you'd like. Sure.
That'd be great. Thank you, Ashley.
Yeah. I guess I echo several sentiments that David shared with us today, specifically relative to communication. So, communication is such an integral and important piece of everything that we do. I think maybe not exactly to quote Brian Vance, but something to that nature of it's progress that drives a lot of the funding that we receive. The good progress that we're doing, it's incumbent upon all of us to ensure that, the parties, the various parties, whether they're those sitting here today at the table, our tribal partners, our other stakeholder engagements and partners and whatnot, we need to be sure that we're communicating with all those parties as well, right? So I think we collectively share a desire for continued progress of the Hanford mission in and of itself. That's why we're all jointly engaged in these activities, right? We have a commonality there. We talked a lot earlier today about the HIPPL, so I don't necessarily want to go into all of that, but I think from that discussion, I think we have some clarity potentially for this group too on, the engagements that we do with the different parties to ensure that we've got kind of progress and continued alignment, to David's point too, and the communication on where some of those priorities exist and where they are. We've talked today too that, Hanford's objective is to take a risk-based approach, with worker safety and health as the priority for our work to activities as we progress. So we will continue to work on the tank work and the risk reduction efforts. And, again, the progress that we've had is a tenet and a success, and we should all share in that to recognize that we've had a lot of good work, to include many of the DF-LAW successes, the Melter Heat Up, the TISCR, the K-East, ISS that I mentioned earlier. So I think, Brian Vance has done a very tremendous job leading the Hanford organization and the RL and the ORP sides of this for continued progress with the Hanford sites, and we'll continue to work with our partners as well.
Thank you. Do we have a representative from EPA on the line right now who would like to weigh in? I don't believe I see one. Do we?
Yeah.
We do.
Hi.
Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
This is Craig Cameron. I'm kind of the stucky because Dave had to go somewhere else. So I didn't necessarily have anything prepared, but I guess I would say I do appreciate the work that David Bowen has been doing, and the state. Obviously, funding is important. As part of the federal government, we can't lobby. We don't have that role like the state potentially does, but we appreciate that. I'm not sure what Dave Enan said during the HIPPL discussions, but we always want to be able to understand what what the funding is as soon as we can get that information, and the more detailed the better, so that we can understand whether people are serious about attaining certain milestones, or doing some of the work that we need to do. And we want to be able to influence those priorities, and to do so before the money gets pigeonholed into the various control points potentially. So that's where we're at. And I guess I would make a comment on the making and showing progress. I just want to give the example that we do have the PW1, 3, and 6 and CW5 waste sites in the 200 area that already have a rod over them that we could be making progress on if people chose to fund and prioritize that work. So, it's to us, it's, we have a stake in not just the VIT plant, but the rest of the cleanup where the material's already been released into the environment. So not just building D&D, but also waste site, investigations, authorizing the work and doing the remedial actions, and, expanding and dealing with groundwater pumping trees and groundwater plumes. So that's kind of our perspective, I guess, since I had to kind of make this up as I went along.
Well, you're doing a great job, so I think you could do stand up if you need a second job on the ad-libbing. It's very good, yes. Are there questions or comments from committee members? Steve?
Yeah, I guess I just, beyond the money, I know we're BBC, but Dave, can you kind of give me your top 3 concerns coming up in the coming year? Yeah, kind of a top 3 issue thing that you're feeling you want to focus your challenges on?
That's a great question. I think top of mind for me, and it's not necessarily directly budget related, but long term it is because it impacts permitting, is we have a site-wide permit that we're working on. It's called Rev 9. It's 21 years old, I think, at this point. Typically you renew a permit after 5 to 10 years, reissue, that type of thing. We initially went out to reissue this permit in 2012. It got bogged down. The last 2 years, we have made a concerted effort to get all the information we need together. And it's huge. This permit is tens of thousands of pages. It's not, 20 pages or 50 pages because it has 580 square miles it's covering. So that's one of our priorities. Getting the DF Law facility up and running, making sure that we're responsive in the permitting space, so that ecology isn't in the way of progress on that facility, and getting it online has been really important. I think we've finished all the permits that they need. Now it's to pay attention for modifications that might have to come through based on what we learn. So we're watching really closely on that. And I just got out of meetings, so budget's on my brain. And, right now, the contention in the House, there's potential for government shutdown. Even they may not get to a continuing resolution, let alone passing a budget. And, every one of those things is a distraction and potential slowdown of work. So that piece is huge, but it's not really in our control. There are so many things that have happened in the last year that are on the positive side. We've settled many disagreements. We're wrapping up holistic negotiations. So getting that wrapped up, getting a final draft down. We're down to the last few sentences. When you take a conceptual idea that you've bounced around for several years and try and put it into words, it's been really good working with Energy to get to the point we are, but we got a few sentences left and we'll be ready. So when that happens, we'll be rolling out the public process part of that holistic negotiations. We'll be rolling out the public process part for the site-wide permit. And then there's a dangerous waste permit that's pretty significant that's coming out, and Permafix Northwest permit should be coming out. So there's going to be a lot of public process on a lot of our work in 2024. So those are kind of the major things that are on my brain right now.
Great, thank you.
Chris?
Yeah, Dave, as you know, the life cycle cost schedule scope life cycle report that was issued in 1922, in the low range cost to clean up the site, it had a price tag of somewhat over $300 billion. If we were to get, say, flat funding at $3 billion a year over the 50+ years, we're looking at an appropriated funding of, let's say, $160 billion, or approximately half of what the life cycle report called for. From all your interactions with folks in Washington, OMB, Senate staff, House staff, is there any reasonable expectation that we'll be able to get $300 billion to clean up the site? I know it's kind of a leading question, but
No, it's a fantastic question. It's one I asked.
Numbers out there for the public, and it does come up.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I don't anticipate we're going to get a number on an annual basis that'll get us to $320, $350 billion in over the next 50 years. But I want to go backwards. That life cycle scope and cost report is based on some assumptions, and it's based on worst case scenario. It's based on conservative estimates. It reflects vitrifying more waste, basically all the waste that's on the site. And one of the things that we've been talking about really deeply the last year, 18 months is, ecology was shown as being against grouting, and, we don't want to grout in place. But if there's a way to retrieve, grout, and properly dispose of the waste, when I say properly disposed, it means to be disposed of in a spot where leachate will not leach groundwater, which isn't Hanford. So I don't want to make it sound like not in my backyard, but we don't have a site in Washington that something wouldn't leach to groundwater, so it ends up being out of state. So in my brain, to reduce that 300 to 600 billion dollars, we need to have parallel treatment processes in place. We need to retrieve waste. We need to treat it through the BIT plant for low activity waste. We need to build high level waste for some of it. We just can't get away with not treating some high level waste because there's some out there that just can't be treated any other way. And we need to figure out a grouting methodology that can all be done at the same time and disposed of properly. So that's kind of the path we're on to reduce that number. And I think once we get what the sequencing looks like for that, I think some of those cost report numbers should drop. But that's me looking in my crystal ball a little bit on that one.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you for the talk. So you mentioned capital facilities, and just so we're real clear on what you mean by capital facilities, the big 3 or 4 that you can imagine, just so everybody understands what we're talking about.
Sure. Well, some of it is finishing up the DF Law facility and all of its ancillary buildings, which you've seen a map of multiple times from the Department of Energy. The high level waste plant's going to need some of the same. My echo's back a little for those that are tracking that. Is going to need some similar facilities. There will eventually be a facility that needs to treat supplemental waste that comes from the high level waste treatment. We need to right size that though, because that's going to depend on, we've got that building out there that's mothballed at the moment, and it was built for a certain volume. But as we figure out the different ways to treat through DF Law, through grouting and high level waste treatment facility, we will need a supplemental treatment facility as well. So it's all those ancillary buildings that go with the high level waste plant. And then as we grout, you're going to have to create facilities for that. You're going to have to improve some of the transportation. And it's most likely going to be rail that this would be on. It could be truck, but there's transportation needs within the region around Hanford to safely move some of that waste. They're finishing up a new water treatment plant out there to provide the level of potable water for all the facilities as they put additional units online. I know I'm missing some of the, you want me to focus on the capital facilities, but mainly it's the high level waste vitrification and the grout facilities that need to be built.
All right. In your conversation though, all I heard was east, 200 east, basically. I know that we got a lot of waste out in 200 west, and we don't have facilities to either transport that. I mean, a new cross-type transfer line would be a huge capital project. I mean, that's 7 miles of radiation protection piping.
Yep, and they're in the middle right now of evaluating the existing cross-site transportation lines and what it would take to get them up to a compliant level of operation. I've heard a rough number, and I don't remember it off the top of my head right now. So yes, that's definitely in there. Some of the other west side treatment would be associated with these grouting facilities as well.
Thank you.
Others online or in the room? Well, we really appreciate the extra effort going above and beyond to be able to provide that briefing. We hope that you have smooth travels getting back to your destination. Thank you so much. Thank you for the update. And with that, we'll have you sign off.
All right, thanks to all of you. I appreciate that. Have a great rest of your day.
All right, take care.
Thanks, David.
I think you look like James.
He did. Yeah, James Conley.
All right, so we are ahead of schedule, but we're moving into committee business and committee recognition. So Chris, do you want to lead us through that?
Right. First off is committee business, and I'd like to have discussion, not only with people here, but with people online especially who have been involved with years past with the production of advice on work priorities. I'd like to talk about, is there a better way in which our work priorities can improve, be more effective, and have more impact, let's say, to the tri-party agencies whom receive our advice. And I think before we start into discussion, I'm going to ask Lindsay to give us a quick overview of certain schedule constraints that we have to operate in, let's say, in the upcoming year.
Okay, so I don't know that I would say it would be a schedule constraint, but what we have.
Schedule items.
Scheduled items. So in October, we have a full committee week, and I was just fumbling over there trying to find my calendar. So October 24th, which we discussed yesterday at the PIC meeting, will be the site tour and the new member orientation. And then the 25th, which I think would be of most interest to this committee, we will have the budget simulation in the morning. We have a gentleman named Christopher Crawley that will be coming from headquarters to provide that simulation to the board, to the full board. Now, this is the same simulation that Sue and Mia participated in at the EMSSAB chairs meeting in March. So I'm really excited for that to come. Now, at the completion of that, because that will be in the morning session, the afternoon session, we have time scheduled for the group to form their issue manager team to kick off FY26 cleanup priorities advice.
And you've got the public meeting in the evening of the 24th.
As well, correct.
For the rollout of the 5-year plan.
Correct. There is a tentatively scheduled, which I believe, do we know if that's confirmed yet? Mary Ann's going to confirm, but we tentatively have scheduled the public meeting for the Hanford site 5-year plan the evening of the 24th. So everybody should be in town. They're welcome to participate, and we're looking forward to it.
So you get the 5-year plan in the evening, on Tuesday evening, and then on Wednesday, we'll have the committee of the whole. And we're still shaping it up a little bit, but yes, the budget simulation is how the budget process works from the field office manager up to approval with all the entities, and it's very interactive. Everybody plays. It's like, and you get to break up into teams, and you get to role play a particular individual in the decision-making process.
You could be a site manager, what else could you?
You could be O&B, you could be EM1, you could be, I think, Senate staffer or Senator. It's just, yeah, it's
pretty cool.
It is very educational to really understand, and you also have, get through the process, you get given changing conditions. And so you've got to go back and revisit your assumptions and relook at what, I got more money, I got less money, whatever, and making in the real life decision-making process that it goes on way above our heads.
And we have Deanna Gribble online, and Deanna, I hate to put you on the spot. Can you confirm October 24th, that evening would be?
I think that she just did, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yes. Yes, I'm happy to answer any questions about that. We're very much looking forward to it. The pre-notice is out. We're anticipating the public notice going out October 10th for a 30-day feedback period until November 10th. Public meeting October 24th, 5:30, WSU Tri-Cities.
Wonderful. Thank you, Deanna.
Thank you.
Tuesday night.
Tuesday night.
Evening.
Yeah, and evening.
Include all public, so by the library or.
And
WSU Tri-Cities, yep. And Deanna, did you say the pre-notice was going out this week?
I think she said it's out, right?
It's out.
The pre-notice
Yes,
went out.
the pre-notice went out the day after Labor Day, which was the 5th. And I'm happy to forward it to the group if you'd like a looky-loo at that again.
Steve, yeah. If you don't mind, Deanna, that would be great.
I'll send it to Josh right now, and you.
Perfect, thank you.
So what we've got is the simulation exercise is about a 2-hour exercise, for those of you that have done exercises before. And it's just like, and then we'll regroup and kind of do the ahas at the end of the exercise. What Lindsay and I were talking about is then she's going to ask, I've asked her, she's going to ask if we can get a Greg Jones or someone to come in and talk about the Hanford process and all in the pieces and parts. It's in the wish list space. We'll see what happens. But my goal was to take it the next level down. How does the Hanford site develop their proposal, their budget proposal, in the pieces and parts, and show us how does our cleanup priorities, advice feed into that. And then we'll move into the developing the IM team for our annual cleanup priorities advice, and giving our ability to give Brian Banson Company our wish list of what we believe is important. And I think that it's really, this is Sue speaking as well as representing the chair. To me, politically, it is really important that we provide our thoughts on what is important, because that information then goes to, with Brian Vance, as he's busy talking to EM1 and everybody else on what is important.
I think it's important that we recognize that one of the questions that need to be addressed in these presentations is that from time to time you hear, we got a leak, or we got, not just something like that, but just we have something that needs to be cleaned up. And, well, we don't have the money for it. We don't have the budget for it. We can't get the budget for it. Why can't we get that budget for it? I think that's the question a lot of people want to have addressed. So, for example, why can't we get, and the answer may be is we don't have the people to do it. So why give us, if you can't spend $1 million a day, then why ask for anything more than $365 million in your budget? Because you got a year.
Well,
So I understand that point, but we get always these issues from, well, why wasn't there enough money for this? Why wasn't there enough money for that? And I feel helpless to answer any of those questions.
If I could just clarify for October, and then Chris, I'll turn it over to you, so I apologize for stepping in. We don't anticipate presentations per se, but this is going to be an interactive, I guess, simulation. So it's not going to be your typical HAB event. This is something a lot different. So you guys are going to be, I guess, going into small groups, and then you'll be working through that budget process, and then we'll be all coming back together. However, it's not going to be somebody, we're not going to have talking heads up at the front of the room, speaking to you, providing slides. It's really an interactive, interactive dialogue.
Yeah, even with what my proposal to Lindsay for Greg Jones, if we could get him on the Hanford process, is a flow chart of this is what the Hanford budget, and then because I believe, I'm not 100% certain, he's worked all steps of that process and manages that process for Hanford. He can then walk us through at a high level how it's developed.
Right.
And be able to kind of answer maybe some of the questions that we have.
Right.
And so I have that request, and I will be taking.
She's got it. It's in the wish list. No guarantee. I understand. No guarantees.
That'll be a part of our meeting on the 25th.
The Wednesday, the 25th is all about budget stuff. Budgets, high level budget schedule, cleanup priorities, moving forward.
Oh, I think Chris had something to add.
You're gonna talk about that.
That's what we were just talking about, the 24th and the 25th.
Yeah, the 25th.
Okay, well, beyond the 24th and 25th, the next board meeting is going to be December 5th and 6th. And then the following board meeting is going to be February 6th and 7th. And then there's a long time before the next board meeting on May 7th and 8th. Now, for the last 3 years, we've tried very hard to get our advice out before April. So it fits in the DOE budget cycle. And previous to my being on the HAB, that was the same schedule. We tried to get it out before April, early as April as we can. If we want to try and do the same this year, that means the work priority advice will have to be approved on February 6th and 7th. So we have 2 months less this year coming up, given the board meeting schedule, than we had last year.
Right.
And the two previous advices before that. So I just want to throw that out, is that if we form an IM team on October 25th, that they'll basically have to have the advice in pretty much final form by the end of December, early January, because as we know, once it gets in the final form and it goes to the full board, there's a lot of comments that come out of nowhere that have to be resolved. So I just want to throw that out so that people are aware of that schedule.
I am going to say one point of clarification. Chris, you did such a wonderful job last year. There weren't a lot of questions at the April board meeting. There were some, but there weren't a lot. So we actually did, because you resolved the questions during lunch hour that first day.
Well, and we don't have a lot of committee meetings now, like last year and actually the year before. Tom Galeotto went to most of the committees to give an overview of the draft. Last year I went to every committee and gave an overview of the draft, so that everybody on the HAB who attended a committee meeting had an opportunity to hear the draft advice. Looking at this schedule, it's not clear that that's going to be able to happen before February.
Now, with that being said, Chris, now that you just pointed that out, DOE will be there to support in the event that the committees would like to have virtual meetings to discuss the draft advice. So we can make ourselves available to host, an hour or two, however long that you see fit, to bring that advice to each committee so folks can talk through any questions or comments that they have prior to that February board meeting. So we just want to make sure that you have the ample time and the support to do so.
Now, the other thing I want to mention too is last year EM provided budget guidance for the years 2025 through 2029. And for each year, they required the sites to submit budget information in late February to be put into some database, which maybe then ultimately was used for a simulation. Every site had to come back to Washington in early April to kind of finalize that budget simulation. And so, in a sense, if we didn't get it done by early February, information was already being put into EM headquarters into a database from all the sites. So I just want to throw out that was a budget guidance from EM last year. I can send you that if you don't have them and see if that's going to hold again this year.
If you don't mind, that would be great.
Yeah. And actually, DOE sent out that budget guidance to Ecology and EPA in April of this year, and to the HAB, and we were copied on it, and that's how I happened to get a hold of it.
Perfect.
Now, going forward, having been involved in the last 3 work priority advices, here's some thoughts I have, and they're just thoughts. I'm not recommending anything, but I want to throw out some thoughts for consideration. Now, it's probably too late to do some of these for this year coming up, but say for the work priority advice that goes out for 2027, we may have time to take these, to do these, if that's what the tri-party agencies and the HAB want to do. So here's my thoughts. For at least the last 3 years that I've been involved with the work priority advice, a majority of our advice has been based on the 5-year plan update that's come out. Now, the reality of it is, we're based on a 5-year plan, that's sort of a done deal. And DOE's response to us has been, we're happy you agree with our 5-year plan. So that's been the one line response to a majority of our advice. Would it be better if it were possible for the HAB to give advice in the production of each year's integrated priority list? Would that be a better way to get advice into our priorities? If it was possible for the HAB to get involved and give advice into the 5-year plan, would that be a better way to give our work priority advice if that were possible and doable? Both Dave Bowen and Dave Eyman today mentioned that they use the TPA milestones as a basis for their priorities. We haven't done that, at least for the last 3 years. And should we take into account each milestone and use that as a basis for our work priority advice? Rob, you mentioned multi-years. Maybe we should do it in 2 years, and I'll shut up in a minute and let you expound on that. In the last board meeting, toward the end, there was discussion on the fact that we haven't really gotten what we consider to be timely and appropriate feedback. I'll amend that. We have from ecology. I don't think we really have from EPA or DOE. And I think that needs to be a factor considering where we want to go with advice in the future. How is our advice being used? Is it being used? How is our advice factored, if at all, into the production of the local DOE budget? These are just some thoughts. These are just some thoughts that I've had to throw out for consideration. We're not going to answer them here, but I think what we could do is put them out for the leadership of the HAB going forward to consider in the formation of IM team, and maybe charge the IM team with considering some of these in their approach this year. Now, the other thing I want to do is say, over the last 3 years, the nature of how we have given advice has changed pretty significantly. 3 years ago, our work priority advice for 2023, we went from a long list of bulleted items to a specific table to try and simplify and read. So we first went to the table approach in 2023. In 2024, we said, we're going to give 2 kinds of advice. We're going to give priority, it has to be done, and advice that's important if funding is available. And in both those advices, we also added work that was not in the 5-year plan that members of the board and their constituent organization thought should be done either as important or priority. Last year, we wanted to make our advice more readable, especially for organizations that were receiving it, so they didn't have to wade through a long preamble and background. In other words, kind of like an executive summary. Tell them what you're going to tell them, then tell them what you told them. And so we wound up with an executive summary with the bullet items for people who didn't want to read further. We tried to streamline our table by saying we're going to eliminate work that we think is important, because there's so much work that's being done that doesn't appear on the 5-year plan, that doesn't appear on the integrated priority list, but it's work that's done every day. Take down this, do that. And we don't know what the university of all those smaller, lower level projects are for us to be able to prioritize it. We just don't know the entirety of that universal work. So we eliminated, for that reason, important items. And we added some people that we felt ought to receive it that hadn't been on our distribution list before. Like our local representatives to the state legislature. So these are some of the changes that have occurred, but fundamentally, most of our advice has still been based upon what we read in the 5-year plan. Because let's face it, we're not going to say, we don't think DFLAW is not a priority. We're not going to say, stop pump and treat, that's not a priority. Treat groundwater. So there's a reason for that. But it's still in the 5-year plan, and these things are in DOE's 10-year strategic vision. So DOE at headquarters has already bought into some of these things that we're saying, yeah, we think you ought to do it. Anyway, these are my thoughts going forward, and I think other people have thoughts and better ways to give advice as to what we think and our constituent organization thinks we ought to do going forward, either on a yearly basis or a multi-year basis again. So I'd like to throw it out for anybody to comment on, suggestions, just anything having to do with how can we improve it, if at all. Oh, and the last thing is, we continue just as we have been in the past. That's certainly a consideration too.
Dan?
The milestones that were talked about this morning, I think it's something, I feel like we really missed a big opportunity there. And I'm wondering if it would be possible to start looking for subject matter experts now for the IM team that's going to be formed on budget advice, so that they can get a good head start on gearing the budget advice to the milestones, get a better understanding of how the milestones influence the timing and then the priorities of the budget.
This was interesting because, Sue, you'll remember we had a long discussion in our operations work group about milestones. Right now, or in the past, we don't have a committee which has really had a charter to track milestones, due dates, whatever. How are we doing? And there was a fair bit of discussion on that. Is where would this fall in some of the new committees? And I don't think we ever exactly came to closure on that. We discussed it.
We kind of folded the milestone tracking into the individual committees for them to track their own milestones. Kind of like the budget and schedule, and we initially thought safety is that those things fell under the purview of, from a project management perspective, of that particular.
Do we know enough about the milestones to do that?
Yeah, I think we need to be really clear. We're talking about TPA milestones,
Yeah.
correctly?
Right.
Well,
That's what I thought.
then let's, that's a really good point, because they had updated and revised them here in the last couple of years. And, maybe ecology could come in and give us a nice discussion of the all the various milestones that are coming up in this next year plan. Okay, so have them specifically. So if we're looking on the budget advice plan for 25-26, okay, we look at the milestones in 25 and 26 before we look at anything else. And then when we look at the budget, we see that we can meet those, or they've been dropped off and we can have an advice point or whatever. But if we had a good understanding of all the particular milestones coming due, I had asked Ryan, I think, at the very beginning, a year or so ago, and I said, I'd really like to know all the milestones you think the Tank Waste Committee could have an effect on. And he spent a good amount of time looking for those. He said he had a huge list. I haven't received it yet. But I think that's a good perspective. We stick to the TPA milestones. We look at what's got to come due and when. And we offer advice to see that it's adequately funded to be able to meet that milestone. I don't want to adjust milestones. I mean, that's way above our pay grade. It's the tri-party agreement. That's our holistic negotiations in there. So, but, I mean, does that kind of make sense? Because then we can focus on a couple of years. We have what DOE wants to accomplish. We have the milestones. We take a detailed look at that. Are they going to make it? Is it important enough to us?
There's two people online. Jeff, do you want to open up?
Sure. My question is, to what extent and how are the TPA milestones enforceable? In other words, do they have any real teeth?
Is Jerry online? Is JP Jerry?
Does anybody want to take a response at that?
Yeah, Jeff, here's the cynical view. If it looks like a milestone is going to be missed, they tend to be renegotiated.
Okay, so that basically means that, you know, they're not really enforceable.
But they also could end up in court. I mean, it's a case of if the agencies, and we've had this happen, we had it over COVID.
So
It's a
Jeff,
tool.
I'm not a TPA expert or a milestone expert, but I definitely can take that question back and loop back around with this committee and provide the answer for you.
But technically, yes, they are enforceable. Yes, they, you know, the good business practices, if you think you're gonna miss it, go back and talk, you know, try and renegotiate it. But if the agencies don't agree, it can end up in court. Because the TPA is I believe, I'm not 100% certain, is a legally binding document. It's a legally binding agreement between all three agencies.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you.
Just kind of putting that, yeah. Or yeah, sorry.
Deanna, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yes, just confirming that the TPA and the consent decree are both legally binding documents. Thank you.
Thank you, Deanna.
Yeah, and Jeff, here's an example of an issue with the TPA milestones. In our FY25 work priority advice, we urged that the milestone governing the cleanup of 300-296 spill beneath 324 be accelerated. Now, the milestone calls for the cleanup to have been completed by November 2025, which means it was in fiscal year 2026. We wanted to see it actually completed in the year 2025 to ensure that it would actually be completed. Well, now who the hell knows when it's going to be completed, given the fact that they found a lot more contamination than expected below 324. So we did try, and at least in that one case, link a work priority advice to a milestone, but unforeseen events means that it's totally off the table, and we don't know when a new milestone is going to be issued for that advice. So that's one problem, one issue with milestones.
And it looks like Dana put a comment in the chat. If you guys want to take a look, it just says, as a note, the November 15th, 2022 Committee of the Whole included presentations on the TPA, RCRA, and CERCLA. So I would assume Josh, those are available on Hanford.gov.
Yes, I was the one put the note in. I just confirmed that.
Okay, thank you. And then I think Mia's been waiting patiently.
Yep. Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I don't see an issue with changing kind of the guidance of the cleanup priorities to start looking at milestones. The only thing is that we would be leaving out things that we put into our priorities advice that are not a milestone, and I'm referring to the indirect supporting activities. There were about 4 different points under that area that are not a milestone. And I think they're still really important for the board to express to the agencies in the advice. So I don't want to limit us to just including milestones and that's it. I am wondering if it's a possibility to, this year we would be looking at fiscal year 2026. Is it possible to skip a year and look at fiscal year 2027? And would that make the advice more actionable for the agencies than kind of providing advice too late for DOE and the agencies to do anything with it? So is that an option?
Well, then we just have the 2025 information to make 2027 decisions on. This 2026 isn't out yet. Would that hamper us? I mean, Brian did mention that he pretty much follows everything. Nothing much changes.
I think combining a couple years together is probably more appropriate, largely because the group is really only going to meet 3 maybe times this year, and 6 total in order to define a advice. So, we're not going to meet that often, and so we need time. And I appreciate DOE generously saying, we can do online and things like that to help streamline the advice. But again, getting advice out is, it's kind of difficult sometimes to get everybody there, and then you show up to the meeting and then you've got all these people that don't like it. Well, I didn't just speak up first time. No, why didn't I know this already? And so we have those kind of things going on, and we're only going to meet so many times. So if we combine them into 2 years, possibly it might be easier for us. And I like what Mia said is that, maybe they could start packaging, looking at bolstering the 27, what's going to be accomplished in a combination.
And I would just like to reiterate, Stephen, I don't mean to step in, cleanup priorities advice is requested annually from all sites. And so this is something that comes from, headquarters, that these requests are going down to each site. And so this is something that they're looking to receive annually as well. So if it's something, so if that's something that you could take into consideration, that headquarters is looking to see this from all sites across the EM complex, I think that it would be good.
Can you show us
I did not know
that. The EMSSAB charter.
So that came directly from Kelly Snyder, but I'll reach out to Kelly and I'll touch base with her to see if it's like spelled. I know it's not spelled out in the charter, but it is something that they're doing at every site.
Sue, have you seen any formal letter to the extent that?
I don't know off the top of my head.
And we'll see Kelly too in person.
I have to go dig. I know
think
that.
That's the first I've heard of it all the time I've been involved, that it's a requirement of headquarters. That's never been voiced before.
I wouldn't put it in the requirement, I would probably say it's an expectation.
It's a request that comes from headquarters. So I wouldn't say, like you said, Sue, I wouldn't call it a requirement, but it is requested from EM headquarters of all of the sites.
So do they,
And I do know that I know when he talked to the Northern New Mexico HAB just a couple of months ago, he did express how valuable he considers the input from the sites and that it is important to him. And I think that he's also sent correspondence out basically stressing to these site managers the importance of briefing and working with the various advisory boards in addition to all the other stakeholders.
Right. We want to hear what the priorities are of our stakeholders.
So then is there a format that we don't know yet exists that is standardized?
I'm going to tell you, Mia did a benchmarking of other sites of their priority advice. So Mia, can you answer that question? Because she looked at others.
So not all of the sites wrote advice every single year. And I don't know if sorry if I missed the first part of the question. But it wasn't an annual, not all of the sites did annual advice. I think the HAB, without a doubt, was the one that actually did it annually. And the other sites were hit or miss on whether they submitted the cleanup priorities advice or not.
So Mia, was there a format, like a standardized format, I think is what Rob's question
Oh,
was?
sorry. No, it was all over the place. Everyone had their own version of how to do the advice. And then the TPA or not TPA, but the DOE's responses were also all completely unique, dependent on the site.
Thank you.
Without any prejudice to the Hanford Advisory Board advice, was there one that stood out that came across better?
I would have to go back and look at it. I know I was looking more at the DOE responses to the advice and trying to find examples of things that the HAB would like to see as a response to our advice. So I was more focused on that than reading through and seeing what the advice looked like. So I'd have to look back.
Maybe that could be an activity that the issue manager team has on their list.
Judy?
Others? Oh, Steve has been waiting.
Yeah. I think Shelley would like to.
Some public comment?
And Steve, did you also?
Yeah.
Okay, so the problem is when I look over, often you're in line with Josh, so
I'm trying to do this.
I thought you were signaling for a touchdown. So Steve, go ahead and then we'll go to Simone. Thank you, Lindsay.
I guess my only comment was back to getting participation from the entire board and how it has been, well, last year wasn't very successful because we did have things come up after people had countless opportunities, and I thought if we either strongly encourage or put drop dead, like if you would like to add comment or review, this is the time to do it because the hour before it's going in is the time.
I mean, like at the April meeting when McClure said, I apologize because I haven't been engaged, but I don't like those words, so we need to fix it.
Right, yeah, I mean, all we can do is keep putting that out and saying, please read and recognize that you still have only 2 weeks in which to comment on the way we're gonna present this information. Not that we wouldn't listen, but I don't know, somehow to be able to re-emphasize the importance of timely feedback. I know Chris struggled with it, and you know, it's just a tough thing.
Simone?
Shelley.
Shelley, so, what's your last name? Hi, nice to meet you and mess up your name.
I am Shelley Simone, and a couple thoughts that I have, having been on the HAB for many years. When Susan and I, and as vice chair, when Susan and I traveled to, this is Susan, I just talked about
That's his
chair of the board so successfully for so many years. But when we participated at the national level in the SSAB chairs meetings, when budget advice was given by the chairs, almost 2-1, Susan or I, or both of us, wrote the drafts for them to use as targets for collectively gathering from each side their positions on the budget. And so my suggestion would be that you take a look at the SSAB chairs letters to headquarters from the collective at the SSAB chairs level, and that might feed, a little more information. It's been a while since that's happened, so, but it's all there. It should all be there online. So check out the SSAB chairs. And then the other thing I'm thinking about and listening to you talk about how do you get your arms around the current budget is the fact that we do end up, and we will, because it's a complex site and we don't know everything. We're going to end up with situations like the 324 building, not contaminated soil. It's not a plume, it's contaminated soil underneath the 324 building. And where everything grinds to a halt, then what does that mean for the next year's budget and other projects that are out there that might be pulled in and worked on, because this project is going to end up having to go through a lot of redesign. reimagining. So you might add another year out to what you take a look at in terms of what are the out-year priorities, that if there was an opportunity to pull them in, what you might recommend.
Go ahead.
That's actually a really good thought, Shelley, because when we kicked off our 2025, one of the things I mentioned to the team is that if you look at all the items in the 2024, supposed to have been completed in 2024 in the 5-year plan, 75 or 85% of the items listed in 2024 are supposed to be completed in that year. And I said, if they're not completed in that year, obviously they're going to roll over to 2025, and that has significant implications onto whatever work is going to be done in 2025. So maybe what we're saying is, we have a list of we try and identify a list of contingent projects. If something is canceled and funding goes away until it can be replanned or whatever, then maybe a contingent project can be undertaken.
Right.
I think that's what you were getting at.
That's exactly what I'm getting at, and I think that's really important. And then the other final thought I have for right now is that we, being Susan and I, representing the Hanford Advisory Board, most years we're contacted by headquarters and asked to put together a draft. And I don't say that because we're important, but I say that because the board is very important. It's important to headquarters because as rough and tumble as we may seem to them, smart, this board's been very smart in what it's had to say. And continue that, please.
Ms. Susan? Did you have something?
Well, yes.
I saw your hand was up.
Yeah. Susan Lechman, former, was either chair or vice chair for 18 or 19 years of the board, so there's a little bit of history here. And this is the first committee that I joined when I started on the board as an individual contributor, and this was the first committee. At that time, we were provided in-depth information, understood what was above the line, what was below the line. We worked collaboratively with the Department of Energy and the agencies. And because of the long-term history and understanding, I happen to have worked on the site for 25 years as well. So I had some knowledge of how it actually worked, not just on paper, and which was incredibly helpful to me and hopefully to the other board members. The one thing that Shelley just said is exactly how important it is, because right now, at the end of the fiscal year, if whatever project wasn't going to get done or was canceled, there's some money sitting there and they're spending it on something. Not necessarily on that project, because they're afraid if they don't spend it, they can't figure out how to carry it over. Then they're gonna piss it away on some kind of bunch of meetings, and that's what happens every year. At the end of the year, it happens at P&L, it happens at Hanford, there's this money left over, and they gotta spend it. And they can't spend it on a project that's not gonna get done. They gotta spend it so that they don't lose it for the next year when they ask, yeah, we spent all that money, so we still need more. So having those contingent projects that would be allowed to be performed that are already planned, and there certainly are numbers of them on site that are already planned, they're designed, they're not hard over when it comes to security or that. I mean, there are those kind of projects, especially infrastructure. I mean, they know that there are things, so it's really good to look at that, and then that money that they're trying to figure out how to spend is way more useful, especially toward the end of the fiscal year. I think that's really absolutely important for y'all as you continue on the board and look at the budgets and continue to ask for transparency with budgets.
Others online in the room?
Susan, where would you like to go with these thoughts? As our leader?
I was gonna, remember, I was electing you as the cleanup priority czar. I already anointed you as the czar.
Ah, hell.
Got it.
What I would suggest is if you form an IM team, let's say on the 25th, as Lindsay said, give the IM team a first mission, and that first mission is to come up with their best thoughts as to how to proceed with advice. They can take some of these into account, contingency, TPA, whatever, trying to be involved in a 5-year plan production going forward, but have them come up with something which let's say the HAB agrees with. So we kind of maybe standardize things again, but with an eye toward better, best advice. But otherwise, these idea, thoughts, and those that haven't been voiced at all are going to get lost or not voiced. So I think if you have an IM team, give it the first mission of coming up with these ideas and kind of formalizing them informally, going forward. That might be the first goal, the first objective of the IM team. And then they can take it on to move forward into the advice for 2026, which may be different depending on what comes out of the IM team and how we proceed in 2027 onward. But I think the key is not to let some of these ideas drop or get lost in just a day-to-day shuffle of work that the HAB does.
Well, I think that the group should take the opportunity to review the meeting minutes from today's meeting at that issue manager team call, just to kind of review all of the good recommendations that were received today.
Do that too.
I did have another thought, and we keep talking here about the 5-year plan, but in fact, unless it's changed, all sites have to provide the headquarters a 10-year plan. And some sites don't have 5-year plans, they have 3-year plans. That's their window. So they're not all the same. I think that's important to think about. But all the sites are not the same. And then I guess I would caution not going out further than the 5-year plan here, because it's a house of cards, as we now know, very well know, with the 324 and that soil issue here. So it seems like a reasonable window is the 5-year plan, and to look at projects that are maybe a year beyond what the milestone is. If something does go amiss, and look within that window to see what work there can be pulled in. And not really go any further than that. It'd be too much work.
Dan has his.
This is a process matter. I remember we were discussing the new way we're going to be doing business. There was a 90-day lag between the meeting and when the meeting minutes came out, and I think that's way too much, and I'm wondering if it'd be possible, not just for the BCC, but the other two committees that are meeting this week, to get those meeting minutes out before the next month's minutes, so that the new committees can have a written record of the last meeting of the old committees.
Yeah, no, that's been for this year at least, it's been the chair's prerogative as to whether or not they want to certify those minutes ahead of the next meeting or carry those over.
Do them as a draft, just send them out as a draft to.
Are they sent out as a draft to the full committee, or is it just to the chair and the vice chair?
OGR just says the full board meetings certified.
For committee meetings, we've been providing those to the committee chairs as an option if they want to certify them, pretty much as soon as I was done with them.
So I would recommend, because I know historically the committee summaries would go out to the full committee to have the opportunity to review. So I would recommend going back to that format where upon completion of those committee summaries that you send them out to the committee so they have the opportunity to review them as well prior to the chair certifying them, just to give everyone the
Do
opportunity
you
to
have a
review.
sense of what, I know, so, new facilitator question. I know that there are expectations for like the HAB meetings. Are there expectations on turning the subcommittee meeting or the committee meetings?
Correct, let's talk about that offline.
Got
in your statement of work.
Okay,
Thank you.
And I tend to, philosophically, I tend to agree with you. I personally like to have the meetings minutes accessible as soon after the meeting, because if I miss a meeting, I like to know what I missed. So it's like, I like to be able to go and, before the next meeting and say, know what I got volunteered for.
It's also for the committee chairs and the executive issue committee to have those minutes even in draft form before they meet, so that when they're setting the agendas, they can work off of the past meeting minutes.
Right. Well, and one of the things that we talked about a few months ago, I wanted, and Josh may remember, I asked about having an action tracking system set up because I wanted to start tracking actions, commitments.
Committee work plans.
Yep.
This is where those are.
So that way, when an action was assigned or something was like, what's, next steps, it is captured.
In the course of clarification for the committee meetings?
For board business, committee business, totally. I mean, it's kind of, it goes into what Chris was saying. I don't want to, if somebody gets assigned something or somebody comes up with a great idea and we want to do something about it, it'll get lost if nobody's paying attention to it.
I think part of that recommendation I had for the week of October, utilizing October 26th, was to take a look at each committee's work plan. So we have the overarching board work plan, right? So every committee has assigned certain topics. So I think it's really important to take a look at those topics and kind of put them into what we had, it was called the 3-month work plan. And then the committee can take a look at it, see what topics may be coming up for conversation. They can plan any type of potential issue manager team phone calls and, schedule business accordingly. So let's talk more about that.
Yeah, I'm also hearing, don't want to lose this, so work plan, action items, meeting minutes,
incorporated into one document, correct?
Got it.
Kind of, yeah, I just have heartburn with coming up with great ideas and actions of things that we want to do. And it never makes it past the meeting, that individual meeting, that there's no follow-up. And it's just like the great idea, the great concept just got lost.
And if there's any specific requests for the agencies, it's really good for me to have one location where I can grab it and say, hey, this is what was talked about, this is what they're looking for, and have all of that stuff in one document. So when I take it back to ask those questions, I have it all right in front of me. So I think it's, it serves multiple purposes.
And the other thing is, we're getting a bunch of new members in October. And speaking from my own personal experience, when I first came on the board, one of the things that's really discouraging to new members, they come up with a great idea and everybody says, yeah, and nothing ever happens. There's incentive for that new member not to get engaged or speak up or voice any additional ideas. So I think if we take this up and new members realize that their ideas are actually being taken into account and something is done with them, even if ultimately it's no, at least they'll know that their ideas have been considered. And I think that's powerful for giving incentive for that new member to increase his or her participation in the HAB, in committee meetings, board meetings, whatever.
I totally agree. And I think it is valuable for everyone. We all want to feel that our involvement is valued.
And every stakeholder's voice is important. Yep. We want to hear everyone's feedback.
And I just don't want us to come to a meeting, spin our wheels, walk out, and nothing ever evolves.
Can I make a suggestion for that? When someone comes up with an idea historically, back in the day, we used to do that and then talk about that idea, assign it to a committee, and who has the first action on that. It would either be the chair or the vice chair of that particular committee, or someone from one of the agencies. And determine that when the idea is put forward at the meeting as part of the action item, so that you have that detailed information and it doesn't get lost.
And
We had done that years ago.
And you and I went to the same school.
Yeah.
And it's kind of at the last board meeting where I would look at, say, okay, what's our path forward? And we would try and articulate exactly who's gonna do what the next steps are. And of course, a lot of them went to Lindsay, but.
So does that mean we can get the draft meeting minutes of these three committee minutes out to the new committees?
Yes, within
Next
the
month?
next few weeks, definitely before the October meeting.
Oh, bless you, I'm so grateful.
Josh is great. He does a great job.
We've gone a little bit above and beyond talking about work priority advice. But I'd like to go on to the last topic of this committee meeting. And it's entitled, I have a piece of paper here I'm going to read from, it's entitled Farewell BCC. And there's been some email traffic on to the effect that this is the last BCC meeting. And I'd like to read from some of those emails from people who have been longtime HAB members and longtime members of the BCC. So, and then I'd like to finish up with a few thoughts of my own. From Tom Galeotto. Many outstanding individuals have served as BCC members, vice chairs, and chairs over more than 25 years of service. All have unselfishly dedicated their time, energy, and expertise in assuring that the tri-party agencies were well aware of local and regional stakeholder concerns regarding ongoing and planned Hanford activities. During that period of time, the BCC provided over 20 specific formal advice transmittals to the TPA that asserted Hanford funding needs, that assessed Hanford funding needs and recommended specific cleanup priorities and other actions to be pursued. These folks have spent countless hours in full HAB meetings, BCC subcommittee meetings, and issue management team meetings in doing their very best to fulfill the responsibilities to the HAB, to the TPAs, and to the stakeholder organizations that they represented. Many of the issues were hotly debated both within the HAB and within the TPA as well, and were able to be accomplished with a final consensus position. This reflects positively on the BCC, on each individual involved with it. We, the final members of the BCC, have had the privilege of standing on the shoulders of those dedicated BCC individuals that have preceded us. And we have carried the torch forward with that same dedication and positive spirit. Congratulations to all. Here's from Jerry Paulette. As someone who chaired or vice chaired BCC for many years, I appreciate Tom's thoughts. I share the dismay over disbanding the BCC. There were many years where BCC provided more advice than any other committee and in which BCC advice was crucial for congressional review and support of cleanup budgets. The budgets are where the real decisions occur. BCC played a major role in reforming US DOE's contracting as well, much to the benefit of US DOE and Hanford cleanup. With the potential of $3 billion a year budget, input on prioritization and efficacy will be more vital than ever. Thanks to all of you who have dedicated yourselves to these efforts. And lastly, from Shelley Simone, sitting in the back. As the EM complex sees the wind down of cleanup across its site, there will certainly be less needed muscle to lobby for EM cleanup dollars. I believe the best way to build resilience for that time is to thoroughly inform local citizens of the cleanup yet to be done, the technology and disposition demands, and budgets necessary to accomplish that work. Champions for cleanup come from an informed citizenship. The board's work and implementation of public meetings sustain that base. It will be needed in the future. Thank you all for the you have brought to the board. Your leadership in gathering opinions from the HAB committees, synthesizing it into a document for full board consensus, was a testimony to your desire for site cleanup, public participation, and transparencies by DOEM. I salute you. So those are our thoughts from 3 emails from folks who have been longtime board members and who have participated for many years in the BCC in the past. And here are a few thoughts of my own. A year and a half ago, when I accepted or was asked to become interim chairman of the BCC committee, it never crossed my mind that I would be the last chair of the BCC committee. That's actually the further thing from my mind. But change happens. Nothing is constant except change. Circular-driven cleanup has occurred for this site for the past 20 to 35 years. And if we believe the last 2022 scope, cost, and schedule report that was issued, cleanup will be completed, sort of, at this site in the next 52 years. We would all be naive to believe that given the technical and technological changes that are going to occur over the next 50 years, the demographic changes, climatic changes, cultural, sociological, governance changes, that these changes aren't going to have a significant impact on how cleanup is done at this site. They will. And none of us really know what that impact is going to be. So where I'm going is that I'd be very surprised in the future if the BCC committee isn't reincarnated at some point under a different name, perhaps, and with a different mission and charter, but nevertheless with a focus on scope, schedule, cost, and funding. I think it will have to be going forward, and like I said, I'd be surprised if it isn't. It won't happen next year or the year after, but somewhere down the road, we'll see a rebirth of this committee. And that's my thoughts in closing. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, everybody who's listening in. And there is some cake here, and please have some. I don't want to have to take it home and look at it in the face for the next couple of days. And it's gonna resurface tomorrow for Rob's tank waste committee. But please have some now. And again, thank you all.
Chris, thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Oh, and this meeting's adjourned.